Good morning. I'm so glad you joined us. It's quite chilly out today. But good morning, everyone who's arriving in person, but also to everyone who's watching online. Welcome to CSIS, and thank you for being here for our final event of the year, Critical Minerals 2025 Year in Review and looking ahead to 2026. If you had told me a few years ago that we'd begin filling a room on a chilly day to talk about permitting, price volatility, and processing capacity, and that people would show up early, I wouldn't have believed you. But here we are. And that alone tells you how far critical minerals have moved, from the margins to the mainstream discussions happening here in Washington. When we launched the Critical Minerals Security Program, the goal was simple but ambitious: to provide evidence-based leadership to the United States as it races to build the resilient mineral supply chains it needs for national, economic, and energy security. We wanted to take critical minerals out of policy silos and place them where they belong, at the center of national security, economic competitiveness, and geopolitical strategy. 2025 has been a game changer for minerals security. This year, we've seen unprecedented efforts across Congress, the executive branch, allies, and industry around the reality that secure minerals access underpins every part of our security. Critical minerals have become embedded in nearly every major policy debate in Washington: defense readiness, energy security, industrial policy, trade, and alliance management. But at the same time, it's been a year of sharp contrast. We've seen historic levels of policy attention, new financing tools, and deeper engagement with allies. But we've also seen persistent market volatility, long project timelines, fragile demand signals, and strategic competitors continuing to weaponize key mineral supply chains. There's a growing recognition in Washington and beyond that minerals are not just commodities. They're in fact strategic assets essential to our security. They sit at the foundation of our defense industrial base, energy resilience, and technological leadership. When access is secure, nations compete, and when it's not, they become vulnerable. Looking ahead to 2026, the stakes only rise. The cost of delay, whether in permitting, financing, or coordination, continues to grow. The luxury of time is not something the sector or our country has. Today's event is designed to do three things. First, to take an honest stock of where we are after 2025, what's worked and what hasn't, and what gaps continue to be. Second, to examine how government tools, private capital, and allied partnerships can be better aligned with the commercial industries of a complex industry. And third, to focus on what success really looks like over the next year, not in strategy documents, but in projects advanced, capacity built, and risks reduced. And that's why today's conversation matters. We've brought together an outstanding lineup of speakers from the administration, from Congress, and from industry who are shaping these decisions in real time. Their participation reflects a broader truth that critical minerals are no longer niche, but they are firmly part of the mainstream U.S. national strategy discussion. And critical minerals are one of the few areas of bipartisan consensus, and that's allowed us here at CSIS to work across administrations and alongside leaders in the White House, Departments of War, State, Treasury, Energy, and Commerce, as well as other agencies, and across the aisle in Congress. You'll see that bipartisan momentum reflected today throughout the program, particularly in the joint legislative efforts you'll hear from members of Congress working together to strengthen U.S. mineral security. That trust across parties and institutions is what allows our work at CSIS to have real-world impact. Before we begin, I have a few quick thank yous to the people who make this work possible. I want to begin by recognizing our donors, whose leadership and support makes this work possible. Their support enables us to carry out analytical work and have important convenings with policymakers, industry, and allies around some of the most consequential issues facing U.S. economic and national security. In particular, we're grateful to Vale Base Metals, BHP, South 32, and Freeport-McMoRan for their support of today's event. Second, I want to recognize the team behind this program, because none of this happens without them. Meredith Schwartz has helped build this program from the ground up with me. She's a fantastic sounding board and big thinker. Kester and Horvath keeps the entire operation moving and somehow makes the impossible look rather routine. And Samantha Dady, who recently joined the team, is already strengthening our work. I walk into our office with ambitious, sometimes crazy ideas. Let's start a new video series bringing together ministers from around the world. publish a new playbook, or host an event for hundreds of people that bring together the legislative and executive branches of government. And instead of asking why, they ask when. And finally, I want to express my deep gratitude to CSIS leadership. Building this program from the ground up has been a significant undertaking, and it simply would not have been possible without their trust, support, and encouragement. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Hamry, Craig Cohen, Namyu Thomas, Alex Kissling, and Frederick Onwanyu, along with our phenomenal department leadership, Seth Jones, Emily Harding, and Christine Brezo. I wake up every day grateful to work under such exceptional leadership that encourages us to think bigger and reminds us that our favorite KPI here at CSIS is not comfort, but impact. And finally, I've spent 12 years working on critical minerals, and this moment would have been unthinkable not long ago. Today, critical minerals sits at the center of conversations from the White House to Capitol Hill, from boardrooms to allied capitals, shaping some of the most consequential decisions. But one thing to not lose sight of, the impact of what we discussed today goes far beyond the city. As a native Detroiter, I often think about what it takes to make America's auto industry, which employs 4.5 million people, competitive. When rare earth export restrictions earlier this year brought production to halt at a Ford manufacturing plant in the Midwest, it became unmistakably clear that critical minerals policy has real consequences for workers and communities across the country. What we discuss in Washington today reaches factory floors, supply chains, and livelihoods nationwide. Thank you all for being here and for choosing to spend your day talking about some of the most complex and consequential issues of our time. I trust it will be worth it. With that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to the President of our Defense and Security Department, Seth Jones.
Thanks, Gracelyn, and thanks to all of you for being here. As Gracelyn said, my name is Seth Jones. I run the Defense and Security Program here at the department at CSIS. And it's a big pleasure to welcome all of you, both here in person and online, to the Critical Minerals Security Program's flagship event, Critical Minerals 2025 Year in Review and looking ahead to 2026. But I do want to begin before we start from my perspective, which is watching a range of our programs, just recognizing the outstanding contributions, Gracelyn, of both you, your team, and the Critical Minerals Security Program. In less than 2 years, I have watched this program, Gracelyn, your program, emerge as a central voice shaping U.S. thinking on mineral strategy, supply chain resilience, and the intersection of economic policy and national security. It's been very impressive to watch. Now, I work a lot on the industrial base, and everywhere I go now, whether it's Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, there is a significant component now in conversations at 10 Downing Street that I have, obviously here at the White House, and with all of our key allies and partners on the aspect of critical minerals. I think, if anything, what we've seen in 2025 is that mineral security is national security. The two are inseparable. Critical minerals are embedded in virtually every major U.S. defense platform that we deal with and that I've been on, from aircraft and naval vessels to missile systems, communications infrastructure, and emerging technologies such as AI and hypersonics. When we talk about deterrence and when we talk about warfighting, we're also talking about access to materials, whether in peacetime or wartime, like titanium and cobalt and graphite, that makes those systems possible and that shape geopolitical competition for years to come. The question for policymakers is not whether critical minerals matter, but how quickly the United States and its partners can build resilient, competitive, and secure supply chains to support them. This past year has highlighted both the progress and the opportunity as well as the vulnerabilities. We've seen unprecedented policy activity from the administration, from expanded financing tools to deeper engagement with key allies and partners. At the same time, markets remain volatile. Project timelines can be long. Strategic competitors continue to consolidate influence across critical segments of the minerals value chain. This tension between urgency, execution, but also the competitive nature of this is the focus of today's discussion. Looking ahead to 2026, the stakes, I think, are only going to increase. The demand for copper, for lithium, for rare earths and other critical minerals is only accelerating. Geopolitical competition is only intensifying, and the gap between policy ambition on the one hand and on-the-ground capacity on the other remains a defining challenge for U.S. economic and, of course, national security. So today's program brings together an extraordinary and exceptional group of speakers from the administration, from Congress, from industry, and their perspectives reflect something that Graceland mentioned earlier and that we'll talk about today, which is mineral security is no longer a niche policy area. It has moved squarely in the mainstream of U.S. national security. It's not new in many ways. For those who've looked back at World War I and World War II and during the Cold War, there were key elements of mineral security. But it is worth noting that after the Cold War, when policymakers embraced the peace dividend, what we did see is a largely liquidation of the national defense stockpile for more than $20 billion in 1989 as adjusted for inflation to under $1 billion by 2021. Domestic mining and processing, which were already under pressure, had little incentive to expand. China, of course, took the opposite approach, we know, through sustained state investment, global acquisitions, and strategic pricing. It built the world's most competitive, comprehensive mining and processing ecosystem, one that now shapes the global markets and the geopolitical leverage. This history matters because it brought us to where we are today. 2025 was the year where the U.S. really began to confront and to start reversing 3 decades of strategic drift. Throughout the day today, we're going to also examine where to look ahead in 2026. At CSIS, as a major research institution, our goal, and Graceland mentioned impact there, is really to help illuminate the strategic landscape, to bring clarity, to bring rigorous analysis, and to bring frameworks that support better decision-making and have impact on the national and international stage. So, Graceland, I do want to thank you for everything that your critical minerals security program has done and continues to do in this area. When it started in 2024 to where it is today, you really have taken it to extraordinary heights. The conversations today, the goal is to help illuminate what progress has been made and where more work is needed, because there is more work that's needed. Thank you for being here. Your expertise and engagement on these issues that we'll discuss today are essential to this effort. We're grateful for your partnership, and I really look forward to the discussions ahead. So, Graceland, with that, I will pass this back to you, and thank you.
Thanks, Seth. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get started with our discussions for the day. So first of all, restrooms are located on this floor. If you go out the door, turn right and follow the corridor back down to the end there, you will find the restrooms. Between sessions, we'll have designated coffee breaks as well as lunch this afternoon. To keep us on schedule for a very full day, we ask that you return to your seats promptly. Nothing is worse than herding cats, guys. We'll close the day out with a drinks reception. And I trust today you'll find that today's content is as substantive as the relationships you'll get to build during coffee breaks, lunch, and drinks. With that, I'm delighted to welcome Jared Agan to the stage for our keynote fireside, Building America's Minerals Dominance. I am really excited about this morning's fireside.
Yeah, me too.
So Jared is the Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States and Executive Director of the National Energy Dominance Council. He also served as Deputy Assistant to President Trump in his previous term in the White House, and in between terms was over at Lockheed Martin, the world's largest defense company. You have also served in a variety of U.S. government agencies ranging from Homeland Security, the EPA, and State Department.
True, very true. And I'm using all of it right now to help us.
You must be very busy.
Yeah, it's a good busy. I'm excited because we're a new entity, the National Energy Dominance Council, and I think it's proven out why the president was right to create the council. You've seen across the board, about drill baby drill and oil and gas, but we've been a big part on kind of the president is using energy, and I include critical minerals in that, for diplomacy. And so what you've seen is these massive trade deals, but also he's using it as leverage in negotiating all over the world. And what you've also seen is just a renewed urgency around critical minerals, and the Energy Dominance Council has played a key part in that. And I think it just, again, demonstrates, as you've seen out over the course of the year, that this isn't just words. The president is taking a completely different approach to all of energy, but specifically critical minerals.
What does mineral dominance really mean in actual practice for the United States? Is it self-sufficiency? Is it control over certain strategic nodes of the supply chain? Is it trusted supply chains with allies? What is minerals dominance?
Yeah, I think the simplest answer to that is that our military has what it needs, and that our entrepreneurs here in the United States have what they need. And so to unpack that a little bit, it's essentially that we are not reliant on any foreign entity for any of the must-have critical minerals or the supply chain to those critical minerals. And so we have taken, as I've mentioned, a very unique approach, a streamlined approach, both from the permitting perspective to funding perspective to partnerships that really, I think, is going to be one of the marquee things that this president is going to be known for, is just kind of throwing the old rule book out the window and taking a completely renewed interest, an urgent interest in making the United States energy dominant, but also a leader in critical minerals again. And the way he has leveraged every tool at his disposal to do that, I think, will go down in history as one of the key moments and key policy decisions that President Trump made.
And what do you think is the single biggest constraint holding us back from achieving this?
So I think we're making a ton of progress. The key here is you can look across the board. Permitting, huge problem. We handicapped ourselves here in the U.S. under the previous administration of just an all-out war on mining in the United States. And so we were able to kind of quickly turn that around, in that using things like Fast 41 and emergency permitting to switch that around. I do think we're making progress. The issue is, as kind of everybody who's here I'm sure knows, is it's very long lead when it comes to mining and critical minerals. Ramping this up, it takes a long time. And so the biggest constraint we have is we need to move fast now, but how do we ramp up as quickly as possible? And so funding becomes a big part of that, and that's where these partnerships between the U.S. government and private sector become key, because we can do so much from the government side. We need the private sector side to join in, and then also, we need global partnerships, because we are blessed with resources here. There are other countries that are blessed with other resources that we need, and then we need to ramp up the processing. And so all of that takes time. And so we've moved very quickly in the early stages of this administration. We've made a ton of progress, and like I said, we're using different tools that the president has at his disposal, but it is going to take a global effort, and all of that takes time to ramp up.
I want to come back to the tools in a second, but first, how is this administration thinking about risk sharing with the private sector? Mining is a notoriously complex sector because you have the long project timelines, you have price volatility, you have geopolitical risks, you have technology risks. How are you thinking about risk sharing with the private sector?
Yeah, well, you've seen a completely different approach to any of this than ever before. You saw that with the equity deals, the debt deals that we've done. The MP deal, for example, I think what was kind of a line in the sand that we were not going to do things the old way, that we were going to take a very aggressive approach to close the gap with China. But we view it essentially that as I've mentioned, we can do a lot from the federal government, but it's also about the markets, and it's about what the private sector do, and it's about no one affecting the markets that could dump minerals or change kind of the private sector side to this. And so we view it as we're going to put skin in the game. A lot of that helps when you're working on mining globally. You know, when you're in the international game and you know that you're working with a company or a project that the U.S. backs, and so that gives it more credibility and more ability to kind of sustain those long lead times that are needed, that if the U.S. government is behind it, you know that this project is probably going to see through fruition. And so that's the way we look at it. We know, we're tracking it very closely of what minerals we need, what we're behind and need to ramp up on. And so we take it very seriously, and we're doing a very methodical approach across the board, across the periodic table, to ensure the president wants to be the leader in all of this.
What do you think the most effective tools the administration has used this year are?
So I think it's the aggressiveness and the business approach of President Trump, and so I'll give a couple examples. So in Alaska, there's a ton of resources at our disposal in Alaska, and a lot of mining that could be done and has lingered for decades. Same can be said about copper mining in Arizona. I mean, it's just these projects that we've identified. We know the resources are there, but they've just languished in either funding problems or legal problems forever. And so in Alaska, for example, we had a project to build the Ambler Road, which would get access to tons of mining potential. And it's just, they've talked about this road for decades and no one was ever able to do it. Well, we brought it to the president in the Oval and explained to him that he could use his authority to basically jumpstart this project. And he looked at it and he also felt, hey, this could be a win for every American as well. So he wanted to build a partnership with some of the mining companies that were up there. And so that's what we did. We built a partnership with them. And then he signed the approvals to get the road built. And so I think it's just President Trump has taken a new approach where he is tired of the bureaucracy. He is tired of the kind of legalization of weaponizing the legal lawsuits against these projects. I mean, that's what really slows these down. We can do a lot on permitting to expedite permitting, and we can do Fast 41 to get things through the bureaucracy. But if people are using the legal system to shut these things down, that's what the president knows is a huge, massive problem. And so he's willing to use his authority to move these things faster. And then obviously one of the big parts we're doing now is working with Congress and helping to streamline permitting. I mean, that's across the board, going to help critical minerals and all the other energy projects we're involved in. But I think the most effective thing is the president just wielding his authority, because he knows that this is hugely important and he knows that he wants America to be first.
I mean, I'm really excited for those of you in the audience. We're going to be talking to South 32 later about their Fast 41 permitting. We have MP Materials to talk about their deal. So we're going to hear about how a lot of these tools have worked this year in terms of accelerating these projects. So to my next question, how does this administration prioritize investing in minerals at home versus working with allies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're America first. I mean, our priority is America first. The couple projects I talked about in Alaska or in Arizona, I mean, these are issues that have been slowed down, and so we want to jumpstart those. At the same time, there are massive partnerships we can build and allies we can utilize the resources they have. Australia, for example, huge mining, a lot of great mining companies out of Australia who are working here in the U.S. They have access to different resources that we don't have. And so building those partnerships of this kind of global alliance is going to be helpful so that we can all work together to close any gaps we might have versus what China's doing. And so you've seen that systematically, the president taking the America First approach, but also finding where is it a strategic benefit to us. So Saudi Arabia, when the Crown Prince was here, we signed a critical mineral deal there. Australia is another one. some of our Asian allies as well, and when the president went overseas there. And so he knows, like, hey, he's going to think of America first, but also there are ways that we need to work together because of the processing and where the resources are in the supply chain. We're going to need to work with our allies so that we're all working on the same page.
So we've talked a lot about more mineral supply, producing more minerals. Now, the other half of that equation, because we're in an era of price volatility, is that we need to increase the demand for the minerals coming out of the US and for allied supply chains. How is this administration working with downstream industries, defense, semiconductors, auto manufacturers, to think about how to create a durable demand signal for US minerals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think this is one of the strengths of how the president has set up the team at the White House. So I cannot tell you, every day people are coming in and meeting with my team, with NSC as well, on what their demand signal is, and so what they are needing these critical minerals for. And so there is no lack of that. I mean, anything from technology to autos to defense. I mean, it is across the board a huge urgency to make sure that our supply chain and the critical minerals that they need are flowing. And so this is, again, one of the things that was key to how the president and how this White House works. We're working directly with industry, I think, like never before. So they felt comfortable coming into the White House, explaining, what is happening on the global scale, and that there is an urgency. And so that's why the president acted so fast to, get funding through Congress, or to set up these private sector deals, so that there wasn't a hindrance in industry that could have happened if somebody wasn't taking it so seriously.
Now, when we go back and look at tools, right, we have DPA, we have XM, we have DFC, we have IBAS. What tools do you think are working particularly well right now?
Yeah, well, all of them. I mean, so we need them all, and they're all coming to the table. I do think that is the difference. Again, just to give you a little of the inner workings. I mean, we pull that kind of group together from Department of War to XM to DFC on a weekly basis to kind of talk about what is happening and what each work stream can do to help it. I think all of those are kind of moving as fast as possible, and all cylinders are go when it comes to the government entity. I think the key is we obviously cannot do it alone. There is a lot we can do, but it's also key that the markets are reacting the way the markets should react, and so that the private sector is also taking the steps they need to take and working with us on it. And so, again, and then you pull in all of our international allies who have more access to different resources or the processing. And so I do think that from the federal government side, the funding mechanisms are working. You've seen announcements happening. I am sure more announcements will come. But it's really that it's several groups involved where the private sector is key, and they need to move just as fast as we're moving in the government.
So Jared, if we come back in 3 years, right, and we reconvene and have this conversation again, what hard outcomes would prove that U.S. minerals dominance is real?
Yeah, I think what we want to see is the ability from the U.S. to not be reliant on any adversary out there or any other foreign entity, that we control our own destiny when it comes to our supply chain and our critical minerals, that the deals continue. I mean, we've set a good pace so far, but this is just the first year. We're just at the beginning. I think you're going to see throughout this administration historic deals when it comes to critical minerals, historic partnerships with the private sector, and then really a revitalization of mining in this country. I mean, I cannot overestimate how many mining companies come in to see us, and even young people who come in to see us who've never been interested in mining, who now are because they've seen the president talk about it. And so if we can revitalize mining in the U.S., get these projects that have lingered for decades, get more people into the mining sector, young people into the mining sector, people learning about mining, educating about mining, and really turn the tide on this war on mining here in the U.S., I think that will be a key over the next 3 years.
Now, Do you ever worry that, 2025 was a landmark year for our minerals world, right? The weaponization of these minerals basically affected every part of our security, national, economic, and energy. Do you worry that we might lose sight of how consequential this year, that some of our progress may roll back 5 or 10 years from now? Because we were once a mining leader.
Well, I think that's where we try to move very fast and where we want to make these deals stick. And so I agree with you. I do think that we want everything that we're doing now to hold, and so that there is not a pendulum swing back the other way, because it will have catastrophic consequences on us. As we've talked about, mining is very long lead. And so I think, in talking to President Trump, he wants lasting deals, lasting projects. And so this is why he's taken such great interest in things like Ambler Road or copper in Arizona. He knows that if he is the person that can get these things done, and he is going to wield the tools to get them done, and once they're off and running and jobs are coming and it is affecting our supply chain here and we're getting the resources we need, it's going to be very hard to then make the argument or kind of the legal battles to shut off something that is affecting 25% of your copper in the United States. It just, who's going to want to make that argument years from now? Or if it just fundamentally changes mining in Alaska, who's going to want to turn it back after it's already up and functioning and running?
Are there any other mechanisms that we can be thinking about in terms of how to make these solutions durable? Because mining is one of those sectors that's very politically vulnerable.
Yeah, well, I'd say it's working with Congress. This is the key. We've had a lot of good success in the One Big Beautiful Bill. We had more funding towards mining and towards critical minerals than you've seen. I think now that the key element that we're pushing for is some of the permitting reform and some of the judicial reform that might be needed. I think those are the lasting things. Everybody does come to us. They love what President Trump's doing, but the question is, okay, how do we codify a lot of this in Congress so that it is lasting, so that 10 years from now we're not worrying about it? And so I think that is the key that we're focused on now, is some of the permitting reform, both to streamline the permitting, but also on the judicial reform side, so that the legal battles can't hold up these projects.
That requires working with states.
If it does, but I think, again, you're seeing a softening even from some of the hard people who've maybe been anti-mining in the past. I think they're realizing this is not only a national security issue, it's jobs in their state, it's fundamental supply chain that helps their state overall, and it helps America across the board when it comes to, some of these are huge percentages of what we could efficiently make here in the United States when it comes to critical minerals. And so when it comes to processing centers, again, these are opportunities that we have just not invested in the past, and they can be huge economic boons to the states. And so we've seen a lot of interest from states in partnering less on critical minerals.
And what do you think? There's so many timelines about when we'll be less reliant on China or be self-sufficient from China. What do you think?
Well, the only answer the president likes is he wants it done yesterday. So yeah, we're going to move as fast as possible. I think we've seen a lot of progress. If we were sitting here a year ago, things have fundamentally changed over the course of the year. I think things are going to increase even in the speed that they're changing now, because we've set up a lot of the tools and we've got some of the funding there already to do it. We've got a great team focused on it. All the way from the president, the chief of staff, James Blair, several cabinet secretaries from Burgum, Wright, Secretary Lutnick. There are so many people now focused on critical minerals, and they have been for several months, that I don't see us letting off the gas on critical minerals at all, and we're going to continue to do it. And it's been a huge part of the discussions on the global scale when you talk about Secretary Besson and Jameson going and having these global conversations. Critical minerals is a key part to almost every dialogue we have internationally.
So one of the things we need to do is to also make American mining more cost competitive. It's probably never going to be Chinese cost of production, but we want to make it more cost competitive. A core part of that is bringing our energy costs down, and it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, because we need more minerals to make more energy, and I need more energy to make minerals competitive. Mm-hmm. How do we break that kind of cycle that we're in to make it cheaper to process here?
Yeah, it's a great point. This is where it's great to have the council at the White House, because we're also focused on this. So we're trying to also at the same time fundamentally change the critical infrastructure here in the U.S. so that there is access to power. Not only we talk about AI, this is a big thing that I'm often asked about, is how the data center is going to affect our power generation. But the processing and critical minerals are also going to we need power for that as well. So we have huge resources when it comes to natural gas, when it comes to oil. We've got to get the infrastructure so that it can flow throughout the U.S. So that people have access to power. A big thing we're looking at now is obviously we've bet largely on nuclear. The president came out with landmark EOs on nuclear. That will be a huge component going forward. Again, multiple nuclear companies come in to see us all the time, and there's huge investment flowing into nuclear. And so I do think ultimately when you look at small modular reactors and how that whole space is changing, all of that compared to just the abundance of natural gas we have, we just need to build the critical infrastructure here in the U.S., and we can do it so that all of those power sources are flowing. It's happening in several parts of the country. The problem we have is if you've invested in critical infrastructure, in a lot of the red states have done that. They've followed kind of the president's philosophy on natural gas, coal, and now nuclear. Where the problem is in the Northeast or in California, for example, they have underinvested in those. And so that's where you see electricity prices, for example, raise. And so they're not drawing the investment in those areas. If everybody gets on the same page with the president and everybody is investing in where we have an abundance of power and help flow that critical infrastructure, you're going to see energy prices go down across the board.
So finally, if you had one message for investors and project developers to hear from the White House today, many of whom are in the room today, about your commitment to critical minerals, what would it be?
You have no better friend than President Donald Trump. He is looking at this from a all-new perspective, as you've seen so far. He is willing to put the U.S. government behind important projects. We are willing to flow capital and funding into important projects to get them off the ground. And so this president is the best friend mining has ever had, and I think that's going to continue. And so we want to be a resource at the White House. We want to hear from investors and private sector. If you have great energy projects, critical mineral projects, please come in to see us. And the president wants to be a leader on this, and that is going to take the government working with investors, working with the private sector. But as you've seen so far, the mining community has no better friend than President Donald Trump.
Jared, thank you so much for your leadership in this space, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
That's how you stimulate demand. You just give away phones. Yeah. All right, well, we'll move on to our second panel, and then we have a fireside with MP Materials, and then we'll break for coffee. So I'm really excited about this panel, partially because I call all of these people some of my closest friends. So it's great to be on a stage together. So the structure of the day today kind of starts with a bit of an arc. So what we do is this morning is focusing pretty heavily on some of our domestic thinking. You heard from Jared at the White House. We have a panel here focused on domestic minerals security. We're going to go talk about to MP Materials, about their kind of trajectory and how their Department of War partnership has changed the game. And then we're going to shift to an international roadmap towards the afternoon. So we're going to focus a bit, we're going to talk about international partnerships. We have a fireside with the State Department, with Reggie, who does a lot of their really great critical minerals work there. And we're going to come back with two firesides with two senators this afternoon, with Senator Cortez Masto, who both works a lot on minerals in the context of Nevada, where she's from, but also thinks a lot about minerals from an international partnerships with some of her legislation. And then we wrap out with Senator Bill Hagerty. So you'll see a little bit of an arc for a day. So we're on our domestic morning today. So I'm joined today by Judy Brown. Judy is the head of external affairs for South 32, where she oversees assets across the Americas, including the Hermosa project in Arizona, which was a project that received Fast 41 permitting. Prior to joining South 32, she served in multiple chief external affairs roles for Rio Tinto, most recently as chief advisor external affairs in Latin America and the Asia Pacific region. To her left is Jasper Jung. Jasper is the executive director of global strategic initiatives for global public policy at General Motors, where he leads efforts to drive growth in areas related to supply chain resilience, sustainability, manufacturing, workforce development, technology, and energy. You must be busy. He spent over a decade at General Motors. And to his left, down at the end, but certainly not least, is Rahim Bapu, who is managing director in the BMO Capital Markets Energy Transition and Metals, Mining, and Critical Minerals Group. He focuses on clients in the battery materials, refining industrial space, and has worked on capital markets transactions, including debt, equity, mergers, and acquisitions. And I don't know anybody that can talk more eloquently about the capital challenges facing the sector and where there are opportunities. And as I discovered last night, you are a CFA charter holder, which I did not know before. So I want to get started to a question to all three of our panelists. Judy, we'll get started with you. 2025 was a big year. Judy, Jasper, you guys were involved with some of the transactions that have happened this year with DOE and DOW. From your perspective, what development stood out most to you?
Probably the change in direction by the administration in terms of trying to support projects through equity deals. I think that was interesting. I think the other surprising thing is maybe the slowdown in the EV market and how that sort of affected many projects in sort of that critical mineral space in terms of North American supply. So I would say those are the two for me that kind of stood out.
Can I just go with what Judy said? But no, thanks for having us here, Graceland. It's always great to be part of this and appreciate being part of your program. I think just to double down on what Judy said, I mean, I agree with both of her things. I mean, it's been a big year. It's been a lot of change. And I think Jared also referenced a lot of these things, the speed and the creativity that this administration is working on. I think you see a consistency and focus on critical minerals. But I think, the geopolitics in the world have also really kind of impacted a lot of where we're at. I think you see a renewed focus on rare earths and magnets and building up that domestic industrial base. Judy referenced the equity deals and some of the project-specific support that we've seen for MP Material and also for Lithium Americas, another one of our partners. And you're seeing it across the board. A lot of these projects are being led by various agencies, right? So I think the administration's moving at speed, but so are all the individual agencies and resources, many of which you laid out in the previous conversation.
Rahim?
I think it's been, I agree with Judy's perspectives on the key things that have happened, and the results have been extraordinary. There has been an avalanche of interest across the space. You mentioned earlier today, we've filled a room first thing in the morning to talk about critical minerals and permitting. 2 years ago, this would have been unfathomable. And that has been remarkable. It's also been interesting that, the mining industry is at the beginning still, I think, of a much needed rebrand. Critical minerals is a good moniker, and it's helping. And now the challenge for a lot of companies, producers and investors is to figure out what to do with all of this interest. And how do you turn interest into projects that are producing and making the metals and minerals that we need?
So I want to circle back then. This year has been great. The renewed attention, the effort, the financing. I mean, it was really a year that was needed, but that we didn't necessarily see coming. But I also want to be clear-eyed here. What are some of the challenges that still remain going into 2026?
Well, one challenge related to permitting that still remains, obviously, is litigation. And a lot of the sort of permitting reforms that have passed and are still proposed, some of that is judicial reform, and I still think that's needed. I think the second thing is the challenge around the midstream production of batteries. So we have a manganese project at Hermosa, so it's really a zinc mine, but it's got a very pure manganese deposit. But it doesn't work to have most of the pre-cathode production is where most of those critical minerals get put into. So it's really not economic to make HPMSM in the United States and ship it to Korea or Morocco to put it into PCAM and then bring that back into the United States. So if that midstream isn't here, then a lot of these critical minerals projects that go into that pre-cathode will be, that'll be challenging from an economic standpoint.
Yeah, a couple of things, I think, maybe looking at this question from the demand side. I think Jared talked about the importance of working with our allies and the importance of international cooperation to get access to a lot of the resources that we need domestically. From a mineral perspective, this stuff is buried where it is, right? And it's not all buried here. You can't source it all here, but you also can source the equipment, the tooling, the technology, and the IP, and the workforce, right? How are you going to bring those aspects in to really kind of focus on that midstream aspect that Judy was talking about, right? That continues to be a major gap from our standpoint, right? In terms of, whether it's inputs into batteries, inputs into magnets, inputs into other vehicle components, both internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. I mean, we need yttrium for LED lamps, headlights that go into all vehicles, right? And that's equally disruptive if we can't get the yttrium that we need, which isn't a lot, right? That can shut down an entire shift in an entire plant here in the US. So no one's going to want to buy a car without headlights. So, I mean, it's...
Daytime driving.
Yeah, safety regulations aside, right? So we need access to all this stuff, but kind of brings me into my other point about international cooperation. We need to understand where we can pull demand. And I think in terms of across sectors, both the commercial and the defense sector, but across markets, right? And, to really kind of build on that business case from the demand side. So I think that international cooperation is a really important opportunity. And we've seen a lot of it, right, as Jared referenced, right? We've seen a lot of critical minerals and rare earths built into these investment deals and frameworks with Australia, with Korea, with Japan, with other places. But let's work together to figure out how to operationalize that $500 billion commitment, right, that the Japanese made in investing in U.S. manufacturing. And let's, start thinking about where we can do that. I think you've seen Congress look at a number of legislative proposals that help with the permitting side, but then also kind of really look at ways to leverage those international deals. And I do think they have a role to play in that. So I think a bit more cooperation and operationalizing that would be a great opportunity for 2026.
Demand
Can I
side-
add one thing to what Jasper said before we move on? I think a challenge for 2026 to that point is also the sort of tariff policy. And the reason for that is because if you have all of these projects under construction, we haven't done mining in the United States for a long time. Most of the specialty mining equipment it isn't made in China necessarily, but it is made in places like Europe. Components for like mills are made in like Brazil and India. And so I think there needs to be some maybe connecting of the dots between some of the cost of construction. I mean, there really isn't a major mining project that hasn't gone over budget and on time. So it would be great if we could maybe help make that happen at some point, but.
Judy's invited a tariff question later. It's gonna be great. Raheem, what are our biggest challenges that still remain, especially in a year where government financing has been a bit unprecedented in modern history?
I would say a lot of things are actually working really well. Okay, so if I think about 2025 as a year, we've had a record year of equity issuance. We've had a record year for debt issuance. We're driving projects forward. The level of vigor and interest is very high. The challenges, and so I'll give you, in areas like antimony, tungsten, to some extent rare earths, where prices have moved, we've been able to mobilize markets and crowd in private capital. And that has been really, really effective. The markets that are still lagging are the ones where prices have not yet moved, and we have a near-term oversupply. Now, in the medium term, that should work itself out because we're going to continue to demand more things, and the economy is going to keep growing, and we're going to build more EVs and get into robotics and do battery storage, and AI data centers are going to use a lot of energy and require battery backups, et cetera. So all of that's going to work itself out. But in the very near term, in markets like lithium, some parts of rare earths, graphite, nickel, we have near-term oversupply. And that's creating a near-term price signal that is very difficult for investors to overcome. And we have seen an avalanche of interest, I called it, but it's reacting to a huge number of policy initiatives that the federal government here and governments around the world are implementing to attack this problem. And so investors know something is coming, but in some of these markets, we haven't quite figured out exactly what that is. And most folks are going to wait and see before they put big capital to work to understand exactly where those changes are going to come from.
Is there anything else the government can do to address this investor hesitation? Because as we said with Jared, there's a lot of risks facing investors.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, investors want to make money, right? It's very simple. So either revenues need to go up, and that means you need to fix pricing, and tariffs could be one of the ways that you get there on the commodities. But there are other ways too, right? You could have markets, and the other thing you could do is you can reduce costs, and the government is doing that actually. They're reducing permitting timelines. That reduces the amount of time that your capital needs to remain outstanding. They're providing tax credits in several situations. They're taking tax credits away in others. But there are several different tools you can use. But what it comes down to is you need to be able to show investors that the specific perimeter of a specific project is going to make them money. And in some of these critical minerals, especially the niche ones, that's the challenge.
Thanks. Judy, I want to come back to you. Permitting has been cited over and over as a major bottleneck to getting projects off the ground here in the U.S. South 32's Hermosa project has achieved a pretty big success here with Fast 41 permitting. What lessons can we take from that?
It's a good one. So we were the first mining project to be put on Fast 41, and we are set to have our final environmental impact statement in February. I think one of the lessons is that, certainly each agency does it differently. They have sort of a lead permitting person. I will say that we are Forest Service as our lead agency. I will say that the way they do it has been very successful because, number one, it reports directly into the deputy secretary, and they really do sort of manage it from a one-stop shop. Now, that may be because they have less projects than, say, the Department of Interior, but I would certainly say that the way they've set it up has been very successful. I mean, NEPA is a coordinating it's kind of it's supposed to be coordinating between agencies. I would say that one lesson that, I mean, we had a 5.5-year permitting time frame, which is around what it took Resolution Copper for their permitting. When we bought into the Hermosa project as an Australian company, most of our investors said, you'll never get that permitted. That's a waste of time. I can't believe you've bought into that project. Then we got into the Fast 41. That shaved our permitting time to 2 years. And there was a very positive response from the investors, and we've met every single bit of that timeline. One thing I will say is that you have to bird dog it just as hard as you do for a 5-year timeline as you do for a 2-year timeline, because you do have a resourcing issue. You do have, you know, one thing I always say is the Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, they're there to protect, you know, animals and critters, are not there to permit mines. And so, you know, I do think that one thing I would say is the use of AI and sort of the objectivity of applying NEPA and what's jurisdictionally possible and not possible might be one approach that I think would be very useful.
But, you know, I think also one important thing about your project is it's not just about permitting, right? It's also about actually building the mine. And one of the conversations we've had quite a lot is that the tariff volatility this year has undermined the cost competitiveness of getting this. It's almost incongruent in a way with reindustrialization efforts.
Yeah, I would say that is we probably have almost like a $65 to $100 million tariff impact on our construction. We are under construction. I would say the other thing that's positive about our project, unlike some others, is that we are both on private and federal land. So we need a federal permit for ancillary construction, but we can get started. We have all the state permits that we need, and we're about 50% all the way through construction to build the zinc mine. So, I mean, obviously that helps you in many realms. It even helps you necessarily in litigation, because we've already employed 300 people, and it's, you know, pretty hard to get an injunction when you have that many employees. So I would say all of those things help, but I do think that the tariffs have been a really big impact, and that's because it's an underground mine, and specialty underground equipment is very specialized, and it all comes from Europe. Caterpillar doesn't make it.
It can't be sourced here in the U.S.
No, it cannot. And it's not sourced necessarily from foreign entities concerned. It just can't be sourced here.
Jasper, I want to come to you. You're buying a lot of these minerals, right? You are one of the biggest demand drivers of critical minerals in the United States. And GM has been very, very forward-looking with their minerals compared to other OEMs, not that it's a competition. But prices are, it's a little bit of a competition.
It's always a competition.
It's a little bit of a competition. No, we won't say who it's a competition with. But prices remain low for a lot of these minerals, in part because the market is out of balance. What does success look like in demand-side strategies?
Wow. Well, I'd say at a very high level, success looks like when we can set up a deal structure that's long-term and that's durable, and where everyone wins, everyone makes a profit, and everyone has the ability to cover costs and to add value long-term. I think for us, we have to strike the right balance in between, right? Like, we have patient capital, right? And we've demonstrated that with a lot of the projects that we've had, moving early in a lot of this, in a lot of this space over the last 5-6 years. And it's really kind of been reflected in the fact that we have taken zero downtime in the face of any of these geopolitical kind of landscape and policy actions that have happened here in our U.S. manufacturing plants, whether it's rare earth magnets, whether it's other commodities and components. Our resilience strategy has allowed us to keep moving forward. But with that said, we always have to be looking further down the road. And yeah, the market has changed a bit. I mean, Judy alluded to that at the very beginning. And we have to adjust for that, and we are adjusting for that. But I think that's where working with the U.S. government comes in play, right? Like, we've always talked about, you and I have always talked about the importance of the types of signals and the types of confidence that the U.S. government can the role they can play in this space, right? And I think you're seeing that with a lot of these projects. I think you're seeing that with a lot of their approach. They're trying to be creative with that. And I think that helps, with the near-term demand situation in a lot of these cases with some of these critical minerals, and just kind of helping us to bridge to when the market starts to line up, when market demand starts to line up again with where we're at on the supply side. But I think in the meantime, right, like we can look at where mineral prices are now, and we can look at where things are now. We can work together on trying to find like the right mechanisms to support that. Like I said at the very beginning, our goal is to help the entire value chain remain sustainable and durable, and build it here and build it with our partners. And then so we believe in certain mechanisms there, but we have to find the right balance in delivering value with our customers, right? At the end of the day, they're going to drive all the demand, and that's where we're most competitive, right, with the other OEMs. It's like, how do we create that value? And part of that is the vertical integration of these supply chains, but doing it in a cost competitive way. And we always have to constantly look at that.
Raheem, in Jared's fireside this morning, he talked about the fact that there are going to be more transactions coming. This administration is implementing measures to more strategically leverage public capital to get private capital. What do we need to do to create a strong labor or like a capital multiplier? And how can we better de-risk projects, particularly given some of the uncertainties that we've discussed?
So the approach that the administration has taken is fascinating, and they have done a number of different deals with a number of different counterparties, and they've done them very quickly, and every deal has looked a little bit different than the other deal. And you have seen an enormous pickup in interest in capital markets as a result, and there has been capital flowing into the space. And I would say that has created an opportunity to multiply what the government is doing. One of the drawbacks with multiple individual deals is a lot of the capital that is flowing into the space outside of the specific companies who did the deals is speculative capital that is trying to guess at who's going to get the next deal, as opposed to patient long-term capital like Jasper that's interested in the specific success of a particular project because it has the economic characteristics that are likely to make money. And so it's okay. It's a lot further ahead than where we were when we were doing nothing. So we're doing something now. This is good. If we want to turn around and make capital systematically available to all of the domestic minerals projects in America, then at some point we'll need to transition from a series of one-off deals to a series of systems that investors can easily understand and apply.
And what do you think it takes to de-risk a junior mining project in the current environment? Because a lot of times we get caught up with these big companies, but a lot of the people who hit my LinkedIn box are junior mining companies. They're different demographics. What do you see that we can do to support America's junior mining companies?
The most important thing that they need, honestly, and this is going to be a little bit circular, but the most important thing that they need is prices to go up. Okay? Like if the commodity price is high enough, then I can sustain any number of risks to bring that project into production because my profit motive is sufficient enough to make that happen. In the absence of that, because Jasper's goal is not for commodity prices to stay high forever, you need to reduce risks associated with those projects. And those risks could be permitting, or those risks could be sourcing, or those risks could be the durability of the policy that's in place, like tariffs, right? We know there's going to be tariffs for this administration, but beyond this administration, will they persist or not? So having some kind of system in place, having markets that function and that are not adversely impacted by the choices of any single producer is probably where we should spend our most time.
I want to come back. Something else that can reduce cost potentially and increase speed is new technology. And America has always invested in innovation. This is a conversation we've probably all had at some point. But where can breakthroughs in innovation, whether it's AI-assisted exploration, modular refining, new processing innovations, where can these really move the needle with America closing the gap on how far we've fallen behind for minerals?
Well, I definitely think processing innovation would be key, especially because there's a lot of NIMBY issues in the US. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of novel ways that you can do processing that's less energy intensive and maybe less heat intensive. And I think those would be positive because I think the processing is a big challenge. Even building smelters in the US is a big challenge. Korea just announced they were building a smelter in Tennessee. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they go through their permitting process, so.
Yeah, I agree with the processing gap. I think from our standpoint, maybe a slightly different response. I mean, when we look at midstream component manufacturing batteries, when we look at active material production that feeds into the batteries and magnets and things. I think we're looking at scale on the commercialization side. We innovate so well as a country. We look across the board. A lot of these companies in the room, I think a lot of the national labs, I think a lot of what we're doing, innovation isn't the issue here. Commercialization really is the issue. I think the concern is, and I think we innovate a lot of fantastic technologies, new battery chemistries, new form factors, new components. I think there are things that, MP Materials is doing now. I mean, they're starting out as a mining, company and now going soup to nuts with magnets. And I think, what they've been able to figure out is how to take their innovations and their technologies and commercialize it. And we need more of that at scale in other spaces like batteries, right? And we need to ensure that the policy actions actually support that, like the building of these alternative technologies here, not just the innovation of it, but the commercialization.
I'd point out 3 buckets, Grayson, and I would start by saying, technology has always, for the last 500 years in mining, technology has always been the answer, right? We produce dramatically more material today than we produced 50 years ago. Some of that's because we found new deposits. Most of it is because we figured out how to extract from those deposits more effectively. But I'll give you 3 buckets. The first is we're going to get more efficient at using the minerals that we have already. So there'll be less waste in processes, there'll be more recycling, and we'll figure out how to do more with less. You talked about battery chemistry, that's a perfect example of where that could happen. The second is, I think, over time, and we've got some folks in the crowd that will talk about it too, we've got a really, really exciting opportunity around how we find new minerals, right? And can we apply AI? Can we apply the new tools that are around to get them more effectively? And then the third is processing, right? Like for the mines that we have already, how do we make them bigger? How do we have higher recoveries? How do we get more out of them? How do we access lower grade zones in already disrupted areas? And how do we scale that quickly? And the challenge with that last one is precisely what Jasper said around commercialization, because there are a lot of good ideas, and most of the time, the first time you do them, it doesn't work out so well. And so investors are always a little bit hesitant. But once you prove the pathway, you open up a lot of upside.
Can I add one thing about the dynamics of all of this? So my dad's a farmer, and I grew up, and he always said the best cure for high commodity prices are high commodity prices. So, farmers farm cotton and the price is high. You farm a lot of cotton and the price drops. So I think it's the same issue with a lot of these niche minerals. Like, cobalt, you start to innovate batteries so that you don't have to use expensive cobalt that only comes from one country. And so what's interesting is about all of these, besides the supply chain, it also will have an effect. The price of commodities will have an effect on innovation and the supply chains and where you get it from. And so it'll be an ever-changing and dynamic situation. And the commercialization, I think, really needs to change to keep up with that. I think sometimes when we innovate, we only have one kind of battery, and then we sort of like over-invest in the infrastructure and try to stick to that. And then that gives us less flexibility on some of these like battery chemistries. And so it's all kind of connected, in my view.
Yeah, nobody really talks about the negative externalities of tech and innovation, right? Which is like, if you think about BMW, they're kind of out innovating this rare earths crisis by having created a motor that doesn't need rare earths, right? So that's going to have implications 10, 15 years from now if that's scalable on how much rare earths demand there are. So, I mean, it also makes it difficult to produce. I mean, 5 years ago, I think there were a lot of people that would have been like, I'll invest in graphite. But now there's a lot more hesitancy because we can replace so much of it with synthetic graphite. So we always tend to think about innovation positively, but it does introduce kind of negative and challenging risks to an already complicated sector.
And investors have to think about that risk, right? And so when they invest in these niche materials, they need to know that they're going to get their money back and be able to pay off whatever investment they made quickly.
Yeah, and OEMs also need to think about, right, cost, right? Everyone's always going to think about cost, but also scale and speed to market, right? You can have all these great innovations, these new technologies, but when are they going to come to market? When are they going to come to market at cost parity with some of what's already on the market, and how do you balance that, right? But then you also think about, right, you had referenced the magnet for the EV traction motors, right? There's a lot of great innovation and technology happening in that space, alternatives that are being built out. But what about the other 75 magnets that you need in a car for speakers and for ignition coils and turbochargers and things like that, right? Like, what are we going to do about that? It's not the same recipe. It's not the same setup, right? Like, so the demand is still going to be there for whatever your original source is. And so we've got to figure out like the right balance where innovation plays a role in kind of offsetting some of this stuff. But then also where the reality is that some of this technology may be a little further out, and some of it is focused on innovation, some of it is focused on commercialization. But with that said, I think demand side technologies will continue to increase exponentially. And it's not just about batteries and EV traction motors, right? You look at the robotics, you look at the AI that's being incorporated into manufacturing facilities. There are now lights out facilities in some parts of the world where no humans are working, and it's all just AI-driven software management systems and robots working in the dark with sparks flying everywhere and everything. It's kind of creepy in certain ways, and then all of a sudden you see a part come out of this dark house and parts and components going in. But it's really fascinating where you see some of that stuff. Raheem mentioned batteries as, secondary energy storage, scaling that up, and I think there's going to be a lot of great stuff coming down the pike on the demand side.
So if we were to, I'm going to close on one question to all of you. There's been a shift to thinking not just about mining, but mine to manufactured good, right? We want to keep the minerals, we want to process them here, and we want to make our end goods. And that's really the heart of the reindustrialization agenda in the U.S. If you had one recommendation for your segment of the supply chain, because you're all sitting in different segments of the supply chain that are highly interdependent, right, what would it be?
Well, for me, it would be the midstream. I mean, you need all parts of the manufacturing in order to create that demand. Obviously, there's a lot of other things I could say about how to encourage, mining. I think there are a lot of niche rare earth materials that are needed. But at the end of the day, for investors, if you have a base metal mine, you're going to make money, copper, zinc. And so I think there's probably more that can be done on how to get niche materials from operating base metal mines, which isn't easy because base metal mines are trying to make what makes money, and putting in new lines is distracting, and it can create efficiency, and they don't necessarily make money. And so I'm not saying it's easy, but I would say that's maybe another issue where we need to maybe maximize where we already have mining infrastructure.
Can I ask one follow-up question? Is there any support mechanism that would make the economics of processing? I mean, we've talked about this for zinc. It's just not profitable to be in zinc processing right now. What kind of support does it look like? Because it's different than getting an upfront grant to build a mine, right? What does support to building midstream processing look like?
Well, the midstream processing for batteries and things. Well, I mean, I think I can say why there isn't, and that's because of the 30D tax credits, basically saying that free trade agreement countries can, there were some PCAM projects slated for the US and North America that have been canceled because they didn't need to put it here. So, I think if you can get the stuff from Indonesia and you have, PCAM production in Southeast Asia, that makes, from a supply chain, it makes a lot of sense. So I think we need to look at some of that. I mean, for us, like zinc, making niche materials, we make both a zinc concentrate and we make a lead concentrate that has silver in it. And sometimes if you're stripping things out of those, then you're stripping other things that have higher value. So we have a lot of antimony in our deposit, but if you strip antimony, it could then strip silver. So you have to make choices between what's in your concentrate and what do you make money on and what you don't make money. One thing that I think is interesting is that you're seeing people in the smelting business now actually paying for things that they'll process that used to be a penalty. So if you had, antimony in your lead con, that would be a discount. Like they were like, we're not paying you for that, and actually it's got antimony in it, so we're not paying you as much for it. Now they're actually paying you for it. So I do think that is changing the dynamics of smelting as well. That was a really long answer, I'm sorry.
That's a good answer.
Sorry.
I think Judy covered the processing opportunity really well. So I think for me, if it's not processing, then it's just going back to pulling demand. It's about helping us understand kind of what policy actions can support demand across commercial and defense sectors, across markets, help us understand what roles these other markets can play, who we ought to be working with, like who we ought to be collaborating with. I think the opportunity from that standpoint is when we look at the work that GM has been doing and you look at the automotive value chain, the countries that we've been working with line up really well with our security allies for the US. So I think that there's a lot of initial work that has been done in some of these investment proposals and frameworks, but would like to see kind of a lot of that investment become reality and working together with industry to make that happen.
Do you see a role for Congress in that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, like Jared said before, I mean, Congress has a role in providing clarity and durability, I think, for a lot of these proposals and a lot of these policy actions. And we've seen, several proposals in Congress right now that are fantastic platforms for a lot of what we've been discussing.
Grayson, can I just clarify? Your question is specifically about the midstream?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll give the simple answer from a banker's perspective, and then the detail. The simple answer from a banker's perspective is you could employ contracts for differences to create certainty around the part of the project that is the most uncertain. I'll give you my specific example. So we will have entrepreneurs come to us all the time and say, hey, I want to put up a plant that does this. It's this plant that I want to put up in this area. It's going to process this material, let's say spodumene, and it's going to produce lithium hydroxide. That's the plant that I want to put up. And we as the bank can introduce them to private investors that can price the risk of that plant working, right? It's going to work on time. Are we going to hold you to account? Are you going to be able to produce on time, on budget? Are you going to produce your minerals at the conversion cost that you tell me about? What is much more difficult for private investors to price is the risk that the spodumene will actually be available, right? Is there going to be a mine that comes online in time to supply that factory, right? What if there's a foreign actor that's willing to buy the material at a price that's way higher than market? And then the second thing that's difficult for a private investor to price, because you're talking about an entire economy, is there going to be a customer for my lithium hydroxide in the United States? Because lithium hydroxide itself is an intermediate product that is not being consumed in any great quantity in the United States. So if you build a new plant, is there going to be a customer here for that particular product? And this is an infant industry problem where you've got to kickstart a new industry. And you need to understand that there will be interchange points, and there are going to be different folks that specialize in different parts of that value chain that all need to come together, and the timing might not be exactly right.
Do you think the government should be playing a stronger role in coordinating those different parts of the supply chain, or should we leave that to the free market to self-organize?
I think there are a number of different mechanisms that are out there that you could do that with. You could try and organize it. China's done it very effectively. We could look to them and learn some lessons, probably, or we could leave it to the free market. But if we're going to leave it to the free market, we need to help investors solve this interchange issue, right? Like at the transition points between the boundary of my business and your business, how are we going to grease the wheels?
Can I add one thing to what Raheem was saying that I thought from a policy perspective that's important? Is that I think a lot of times, from a policy perspective, we think of critical minerals, of which there are 50, as one thing, and sort of a blunt instrument that's supposed to address all 50. But in reality, we probably need a more surgical sort of commodity by commodity or critical mineral by critical mineral sort of approach. I mean, they're not all the same, and the supply issues are not all the same. And so I think sometimes that makes it a little bit harder, but I would say from a policy perspective, I think it needs to be a little bit more specific. And that even includes like the rare earths, which are just like one category.
How much yttrium do you need a year, Jasper?
Enough to fill maybe 2 bankers' boxes that could sit in the corner of this room.
But you need it in almost
But
everything.
I need it.
Yeah.
In just about every headlamp that we produce and a couple of other components as well. So if anyone wants to partner on the demand side and figure this out.
Economies are scale when you small.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
We had a conversation. What if it
Yeah.
happens if you need like a water jug full of minerals?
Yeah,
Like how do
exactly.
you create?
And it's 2 bankers' boxes to support our entire U.S. manufacturing footprint. So
it's hard to group that with copper when you think about minerals because
Right.
their supply chains are
yeah,
so
to Judy's
different.
point, we've talked about this all along. It's like every work stream is completely different, and that's part of the complexity here. We talk about the volatility in prices and mining and each project and stuff, but every project is different. Every gap, every bottleneck is different. So there's been a lot of good work, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating to
Thank
hear
you.
about different parts of the supply chain coming together here in the U.S. Thank you. Can you go to the right of the stage? There's a gift for you. All right, I'm really excited for this fireside, and I'm excited for this fireside for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's our last fireside before I can have coffee, and I haven't had coffee this morning. Second, I'm excited because when I look back at 2025 and I think about, a fast-moving year, one of the mainstays of that year is the fact that the U.S. government became the largest shareholder in a rare earths company. And I remember in August, I went out to go see Matt at Mountain Pass. And Matt started telling me the story of MP Materials and Mountain Pass and how they nearly became a national park. And it's a really riveting story. I like to think of it as the American dream for mining in a very clear way, because we sometimes take for granted that we nearly did not have a rare earths company that would have been able to meet the challenges at hand this year when our economy nearly came to a halt because of these shortages. So I'm really excited to have Matt here. Matt is the Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Chief Communications Officer at MP Materials. He oversees the company's local, state, and federal government relations, as well as its overall communication strategy. Prior to joining MP Materials, Matt spent more than a decade in the automotive industry. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, for decades, the United States was the world's leading rare earths producer, with domestic supply underpinning everything from advanced defense systems to consumer electronics. And that dominance really eroded as production and processing migrated abroad, and it left the US very reliant on foreign supply chains. Today's push to rebuild rare earths capacity is not necessarily just about creating something new. It's about reclaiming a position of leadership the United States once had, which is why we called this fireside America's Rare Earths Comeback. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of MP?
Sure. Thanks so much for hosting this, and thanks to all of you for being here. I think we blipped onto the radar for a lot of people in July of this year, but our story really starts a decade ago in 2015. And if you go back to that time, we were sort of at the trough of a cyclical commodities bust. And like every great investor in the space, our founder and CEO, James Litinsky, who was leading a successful investment firm on Wall Street in the time, was looking for opportunities in the wreckage. And he came across, this is 2015, the bonds for a company called Molycorp that at the time had owned Mountain Pass and had invested almost $2 billion between 2009 and 2015 into the asset, wound up in some trouble. And it was very clear at the time, based on the way the bonds were trading and the way the company was heading, that they were moving towards a restructuring event. And so, like a lot of great investors, when you can buy bonds at a discount for a company heading into a restructuring, particularly a company that owns one of the world's renowned assets in a particular class of commodities, you see opportunity there, and he began accumulating those bonds. When the company finally did enter restructuring in 2017, the problem was no one showed up to restructure the company and operate the asset. And in fact, the largest creditor in the estate at the time wanted to put this asset into reclamation. And so the founder of our company was faced with a choice. Basically, lose your entire investment or risk it all and really go for it and leave a really successful investment firm on Wall Street and try to operate this rare earths mine. And so that's what he chose to do. And I think, at the time, he couldn't believe, and our co-founder, Michael Rosenthal, couldn't believe that this asset, Mountain Pass, which was once the world's largest rare earths mine, it in many ways created and shaped the industries. Modern solvent extraction for rare earths was pioneered at Mountain Pass in the 1960s. You could see at the time electrification, automation, you could see these trends coming that would lead to growth and demand for the commodity. And you could also see the geopolitical risk. We have one operating rare earths mine and no one wants to operate it. And so that's where our story started in 2017. We had 8 people. The site was in care and maintenance, and Jim and Mike decided to make a go of it. And flash forward now, 8 years later, Mountain Pass is, again, now the world's second largest rare earths mine. We've got an operating refinery that is scaling in large scale. And we've got a really exciting downstream magnetics business that we are growing to fulfill our mission to restore the full rare earth supply chain in the United States. And I think what this speaks to, what this story speaks to, is that there will come a time again when we don't fill up a room to talk about critical minerals at 9 a.m. But those are the periods of both opportunity, but the periods that we have to sustain sort of our investment and our focus on this space. Because if we don't, if we get complacent again, we're not going to solve the challenge.
When you read economic history, you realize we've been through this cycle over and over. I remember it was 1939. President Roosevelt wrote a letter to Congress ahead of passing the Stockpiling Act, and he said, I'm really concerned we won't have the materials that we need if we need to go to war. And they started a materials board, and but these were start and stop efforts over the better part of 70 years. Now, Matt, you kind of, 2017 to 2025, what were the pivotal moments that made that turnaround possible?
Sure. So I think, when we acquired the asset, the first thing we set to find out is sort of what went wrong. And like any sort of problem, it's not necessarily one thing, but a confluence of things. There were strategic mistakes that were made, reorienting the flow sheet, for example, around the production of all rare earths rather than the rejection of overproduced rare earths. So there's some key strategic mistakes, but there were also operational mistakes, and a real struggle to achieve operational resiliency across the integrated mine and refinery. And so the key thing that we as a company have always tried to do is certainly walk before we run and run before we sprint. And the key thing at Mountain Pass was the predecessor had never stabilized the operation from a concentrate production standpoint. And our founder, Jim, always says, you can't restore a multi-billion-dollar supply chain overnight. So the key thing we needed to figure out was, can we produce concentrate at world-class scale, world-class yield, and low cost? Because if you cannot do that, you have no hope of operating a refinery. And so from 2017 to 2019, back half of 19, it was all about, can we produce concentrate effectively? And a lot of times in this industry, we make the mistake of trivializing concentrate production, but that's an enormous mistake. The froth flotation process for the production of concentrate is very, very technically challenging. You have to be absolutely low cost, and so we really had to figure that out. The first year of production was 2018 in our era. We did 14,000 tons. The next year we did 28,000 tons, but remarkably in the back half of 2019, we started achieving run rate productions of concentrate at around 40,000 tons per year, which was 4 times what the predecessor had ever achieved in its best quarter annualized. So we really got the concentrate operation running effectively, and it was also absolutely world-class. So all of those folks that thought following the failure of our predecessor in 15 that the problem was actually the asset, that there's no way a U.S. company is going to compete effectively in the production of rare earths, let alone a U.S. company in the state of California, they were entirely wrong. Mountain Pass is absolutely world-class in terms of volume and cost of production and concentrate, and that gave us a platform from which to invest in the midstream and downstream and really pursue our mission. So that was the key moment.
Matt, this year, Department of War's partnership with MP Materials has been a game changer. What did that support enable that private capital couldn't do alone?
Sure. So we've had a long relationship with the Pentagon dating back to 2019. If you go back to the first Trump administration in 18, the president actually invoked the Defense Production Act for rare earths in 2018. And he also issued a series of both executive orders and presidential determinations. And that kicked off the Pentagon investing and creating programs to invest in the midstream of this supply chain. And we were a beneficiary of those programs. And it was relatively modest amounts of capital. The first award we received was $9.6 million in November 2020 to co-invest alongside the company in the reorientation of the refinery at Mountain Pass, which we invested several $100 million in. So it was a very nominal amount of capital. But it did send a very strong signal to the market in 2020 as we were taking the company public that this is a project of national importance, and that signaling power is really important. The other thing it did was it created a ongoing relationship with professional staff in the Pentagon that had a vested interest in the success of the project, that would monitor it, that would get updates from us on a regular basis. And so they came to know us, how we operate, how we execute over many, 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 many years. And so you flash forward to April 2025. China effectively ramped up its export controls on rare earths, shut down some factories in the United States, and caused a real panic in the market about availability of supply. We were in a position at that point to execute a landmark deal. And what could the government provide that private capital couldn't alone provide? Well, 6 months ago, the thing that we were most worried about at MP Materials was the price of the commodity, or the price of NdPr oxide specifically, which drives effectively all of the value in terms of your operation. There are many rare earths, but NdPr oxide is the key input into permanent magnets, and it's the key business driver. In 2022, as we were getting ready to start the production of our refinery at Mountain Pass, after investing hundreds of millions of dollars to optimize, after building this very effective concentrate operation, after building our team from 8 to probably at the time something like 600 people, the price of PRND oxide went from $170 a kilo precipitously to $49 a kilo in about 18 months, right as we were starting our refinery. $49 is below the cash cost, according to Bank of America, of China Northern Rare Earths, the world's largest producer of NdPr oxide in the world. That was unsustainably low. Our transaction agreements with the Department of War that we executed in July, there are many features of it. There's transformative capital. There is a guaranteed offtake agreement for a magnetics facility we're building, but there is also a purchase protection agreement which functions much like a contract for differences. And that effectively solved that issue. And I think Raheem talked about, low cost of production for some of these niche minerals being the real issue. He's exactly right. And that was the issue we were facing. We had these export restrictions. The federal government wanted us effectively to go faster. It's great that you've done this. It's great that you're building magnetics business. Why don't you do it at 10 times the scale? But the problem is the core driver of economic value in the midstream of the supply chain was effectively being priced below the cost of production, even in China. We could not address that issue on our own. And so that is really the centerpiece of a multifaceted set of transaction agreements we executed. And what it does is it gives us a fair return on and of our capital and allows us to continue reinvesting and fulfill the mission.
Matt, I have a theory, and I may be wrong, but that price floors are really infant industry protection. You don't need them forever. You need them while you create demand for another supply chain, in this case, a non-Chinese supply chain. How have prices moved since you signed that price floor back over the summer?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think they're up something like 30% market-wide since we announced our transaction agreement in July. And that's really important because higher prices drive investment. They crowd in investment into the space. And so prices have moved as a result.
Do you see prices coming back down in the future? Do you see price volatility kind of being here to stay? Or do you think that, with announcements like you guys signed an agreement with Apple shortly thereafter, right? Stimulating that demand for your rare earths will keep prices up?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get in the business of predicting prices because inevitably if I make a prediction, the only thing that I know is that my prediction will be wrong. But what I will say is that your first point is exactly right. I think once you build a resilient, more diversified market, the way the market functions should return to normal supply demand dynamics. That's not possible today. Because when you look at the rare earth space, China is of course the world's largest supplier. I think everyone in the room knows that. But what everyone in the room probably doesn't know is that because China produces 95+% of the world's permanent magnets, which are the key derivative component made from rare earths, they are also the world's largest end market. So you're the supplier, you're the largest end market, and you control the indices. That is effectively a recipe for there to be a chasm between how a market should function and how it does function for non-market reasons. And so I think if we can correct for some of that with some creativity, things like contract for differences, price floors, we can build up resiliency up and down the supply chain, and then it should over time return to normal.
Matt, MP Materials has been the pilot public-private partnership for critical minerals, kind of in recent years. What lessons can policymakers take from the MP experience when designing PPPs going forward?
Sure. I think the first thing that we should all keep in mind is this is totally doable. A lot of times, I think we admire these problems rather than attempt to solve them. But I think with some creativity, government can play a role in solving some of these challenges. As a result of our July transaction agreements, we're putting well over $1 billion to work immediately in building out the downstream of this supply chain. That is an immediate impact. So these are solvable. I think the other thing to be mindful of is that we can really create win-win-wins with these public-private partnerships. A lot of times we refer them as deals. They are deals, but I think they truly are partnerships. And here's what I mean about win-win-wins. This is obviously a win for our shareholders. We're correcting this economic sabotage. Obviously, all of our stakeholders and all of our shareholders are going to win. We're going to create more resiliency in our supply chain. That's obviously a win for U.S. national security. We're investing and accelerating investment in all facets of the supply chain. But I think this can also be a win for taxpayers. In our purchase protection agreement, when the price of the underlying commodity is below the floor, obviously we accrue a benefit and it's topped up. But when the price is above the floor of 110, we actually remit 30% of that upside to the Pentagon. In our offtake agreement for the magnetics facility, the 10X facility that we're building, to the extent the commercial deals we sign commensurate with that facility accrue financial benefits above a certain level, we remit 50% of that upside to the Pentagon. Finally, as you alluded to in the beginning, the Pentagon is effectively now, on an as-converted basis, our largest shareholder. So as our enterprise value increases, the U.S. government also accrues benefit as well. So I think there's a way to structure these creatively so there truly is a win-win-win, and that taxpayers aren't just taking on risk or preventing downside, but gleaning some of the benefit from the upside as we correct some of these markets. And I think that is something that we should take away. We can do this, but we can also create real win-wins along the way.
Matt, I want to move over to thinking about the permanent magnets. So a lot of our efforts so far have been mining, and we think about processing, but what this year has also made abundantly clear is we have this other glaring vulnerability that we realized in October when China imposed pretty rigid restrictions on permanent magnets. It came to our attention that they make 93% of permanent magnets in the world, and that those permanent magnets are crucial not only for all of the cars that we drive, but virtually every form of defense technology. Can you tell me about how MP is moving from not just mining and separating, but also into the magnet space?
Sure. Yeah, this is the most exciting thing for me right now about our company, just because I've had a firsthand look at building this entire new division up from the ground up. But our vision as a company was always restore the full rare earth supply chain in America. And what do we mean full rare earth supply chain? We mean mining and beneficiation, we mean separation and refining, but ultimately we mean metal and magnet production as well as recycling. And really for us, we viewed that downstream as like a 2025 plus event because we were very, very focused on doing things in stages like I mentioned at the beginning. But in 2021, we formed a relationship with General Motors that was looking to increase the resiliency of its magnetic supply chain well before it was fashionable, I would add. And they came to us because we had a vertically integrated model, talked to us about our magnetics plans, and actually worked out a win-win agreement with us that enabled us to pull forward that investment. So in 2021, we made our first magnetics hire. We actually, about 4 or 5 months later, in early 2022, broke ground on a factory in Fort Worth, Texas. And right now, today, are producing rare earth metal at that factory at commercial scale, and right on the precipice of starting commercial production of finished magnets, traced all the way back to a rock that came out of the ground in California in that factory. And because we had that vertically integrated model, because we were able to pull forward that investment with a really good partnership with General Motors tracing back to 2021, we were in a partnership in July when the federal government called and said we need more permanent magnet production online to not only have an upstream solution, but the capacity to dramatically accelerate the downstream of that supply chain. Importantly, because we had all pieces together, it also put us in a position to address the need for the resiliency that other customers wanted, like Apple. So just days after our Pentagon agreement in July, we announced a partnership with Apple to make magnets for Apple from recycled components entirely produced in the United States. And that partnership was really 5 years in the making. As long as I've been at the company, we've been working on that agreement and trying to build up our capabilities. And finally, all of the things pulled together. So I'm really, really excited about the magnetic supply chain. This is important for consumer electronics and automotive, but as we look forward and we think about robotics, if some of the predictions about the transformative aspect of robotics and physical AI, if they are even like 1% right, we are on the cusp of this dramatic industrial transformation. There is all sorts of security of supply concerns and also opportunities for industry. And so to have all of those pieces now in our vertically integrated model is super exciting because we can go to customers that are entering those and other markets and just be a one-stop shop solution.
Do you think we're going to be able to meet all of our own needs here in the U.S., or will we require rare earth feedstock from other countries? We've seen strategic U.S. financing going into Australia and Brazil. We've seen Department of War take an equity stake with MP as a partner in Saudi Arabia. How do the international partners play with the U.S.? We heard Jared this morning talking about America First. But how does it all fit together for the future of rare earth security, acknowledging that demand growth is going to be a really big part of our challenge?
Yeah, I don't know that meeting all of our own needs domestically is necessarily the right question to ask, or even the desired outcome. What I think we absolutely need domestically is no single point of failures. Like in these critical supply chains, you can't have a single point of failure. You can't have zero capacity or close to zero capacity in any one area. I think that is just a national security nightmare. We have to do these things in the United States at all links of the supply chain. Because I think when you don't do them, you lose knowledge. It's not just that, there might be anything that happens around the world and supply is cut off. You lose knowledge. There's an interdependency between up and down the way these supply chains function. But I think the question to ask is resiliency. Like, it's not can we meet all of our needs, but can we be resilient? And in the context of rare earths, not only do I think it, I absolutely know it. We operate the second largest rare earths mine in the world in the state of California today. Box checked. We've got a refinery that is producing thousands of tons of NdPr oxide per year and scaling. We're adding other elements over time. We can make metals and magnets in the United States. So I think we can absolutely achieve resiliency. I think we can achieve independence, but I do think it's going to require partnerships. And I think that's strategic. Products need markets. Today, we're one of the largest suppliers of NdPr oxide into the Japanese market. That market access is really important to us. But we can also work with our allies to build capabilities abroad and get materials abroad. And there are feedstocks around the world that we're going to need to source and refine in the United States. That's part of our plan at MP Materials. There are ion absorption clays, there are monazite feedstocks, there are all kinds of feedstocks that today, because of the lack of refining capacity outside of China, just flow into China unabated. Now that we have a scaled refinery in the United States, we have an opportunity to compete for those feedstocks. And then as you mentioned, structurally around the world, there are places like Saudi Arabia where having central refining capability could be a huge strategic advantage that could help, I think, create more diversity in the global supply chain, which is good for security of supply to the end users. It also will just help create a more functioning market for all participants. And so we are eager to work with partners, particularly when we can work alongside the US government to try to create a supply chain that's more resilient and just more balanced.
Two more questions. When do you think we will not be hostage to China? Because right now we're hostage. We had to go to the negotiating table 3 times this year, and it wasn't pleasant. So when do you think we will have enough supply that we're not held hostage?
So we import directly today something like 7,000 tons of magnets per year. Just at MP Materials, we're building 10,000 tons of magnet capacity via our existing facility in Fort Worth and our second facility that we call the 10X facility. So we can dramatically accelerate our downstream capabilities. We have the mining asset online. We have a refinery producing NdPr oxide. We are adding heavy rare earth separation capability, expecting to start commissioning middle of next year. So we are a heck of a lot better positioned today than we were a year ago. And I think a year from now, we'll be way better positioned than we are today. So will this take time? Do some of these things take time? Absolutely. But I actually think because of the foundation that we have that traces all the way back to 2017 and not letting that asset go away, we're in a really good position today to continue executing and take this risk effectively off the table.
When do you think we will, is it 3 years from now, we won't be reliant on China for permanent magnets?
I think in 3 years, we will have significant permanent magnet capacity online. I mean, we are on the cusp of starting commercial production for General Motors in Fort Worth now. And I think as we scale that up, we add capacity for Apple, we embark on this production of the construction of our second facility. Others in the market are starting to invest more aggressively as well. I do think we can take this issue off the table. Remember, the tragedy of this story is that in 1966, the US Air Force Research Laboratory invented the rare earth permanent magnet. Prior to 1966, rare earths were used in things like color television sets. In the 1960s, we invented this. In the 1980s, US engineers, Japanese engineers discovered the neodymium magnet. These are things we invented, the means of production we invented. This is not rocket science. It's just creating industrial capacity. So I'm perpetually one that bets on the side of American ingenuity. And this down talk that this can't be done or it won't be done or we can't, I totally don't buy that. So yes, I think in 3 years we can be way more resilient than we are today. Absolutely.
And my final question, going forward, when you look ahead to 2026 and beyond, what do you think is our biggest challenge that could slow down our progress? Because this year has been warp speed, and we really did commit to warp speeding.
I mean, our biggest challenge is our own complacency. If we get complacent about these supply chains for whatever reason, and we don't pack a room with 300 people at CSIS talking about critical minerals, and we stop investing and stop caring for whatever reason, we're not going to solve this issue. You know, in rare earths specifically, the risks associated with overconcentration, they've been known for a long time. There was a famous incident in 2010 that is the subject of an op-ed every single weekend. Yet somehow, in April, everyone is surprised. April of this year, everyone is surprised. Literally, it's the subject of an op-ed every weekend, and somehow in April, we're surprised. So I think as an industry, and I think as a leadership community in Washington, we just have to not let complacency take over. We just have to continue down the trajectory we're on. I think we're absolutely on the path. And so it's just stay there. I think we are our own biggest challenge for sure.
Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate you coming out here. Give us a round of applause. It is 11 a.m., so we're going to give you 15 minutes before we reconvene. Please remember you have to drink your coffee outside, so drink quickly, and we'll see you back at 11:15. We're going to... All right, if you can take your seats, we'll get started.
Are these on?
Yeah. All right, we'll get started. Welcome back. I hope you all sufficiently caffeinated. It was a quick sprint of coffee. So as I said, the next part of our day, we will look at a panel now, just looking at copper and its role in U.S. economic security. We'll then move on to a fireside discussion with Representative Ami Bera from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm really excited about this panel because I think it comes from a very different vantage point as the previous fireside discussion. Earlier this morning, you heard Jasper tell you he needs two post boxes worth of yttrium. Rare earths is a very, very small market. And the tools, the support, the economics are totally different from some of your larger scale base metals. When we think about copper, copper is so inextricably linked to economic security. And in a time when, generally mineral prices have been very low, we see that with lithium, nickel, cobalt, prices are down between 60 and 80% over the last 3 years. Copper is a different narrative. You saw prices in the last few years climb to record highs. And a lot of that is because copper is used in every form of technology. It is used in your pipes and your wires. It is used in transmission infrastructure. It's used in exorbitant amounts for data centers and AI. It's the second most used weight in defense technology by weight. So when you look at the world going forward, it's hard to see us do that in any way without more copper. So I'm really delighted to be joined by some of my favorite friends on this panel. I say that about every panel, but especially this panel. To my left is Seth Levy. Seth heads the U.S. government relations and corporate affairs for Glencore, where he leads stakeholder engagement, public affairs, policy development, and advocacy strategy. Seth's background spans international energy and public policy, and he previously held positions at Equinor, Edison Electric Institute, and ExxonMobil. To his left is JJ Young. JJ is Vice President of Federal Government Relations and International Affairs at Freeport-McMoRan, America's largest copper producer, where he oversees the company's domestic U.S. political activity and global stakeholder engagement. JJ has over 2 decades of public and private sector experience, including Chevron and the U.S. government. And to his left is Dominic Perrottet. Dom is the Vice President of International Affairs and the United States at BHP, which is the world's largest copper company. So we have some good friendly competitors on this panel. He oversees the company's international operations and engagement. He's the former Premier of New South Wales in Australia, where he led one of the largest state economies and advanced major reforms across infrastructure, energy, and economic policy. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I want to get started. I'm going to let's set the table a little bit for our audience. Copper, as I said, is a large-scale commodity. Global demand is expected to nearly double by 2050, and that's coming off of a pretty significant demand signal right now. What is the single most underestimated demand driver or underappreciated when we talk about copper's role in economic security? Seth?
Sure. Well, great to see everybody and see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Good morning. Happy Monday. In terms of copper, the obvious one is going to be the AI, the data center trend. I think we can't forget that construction still uses a lot of copper. We can't forget that, as you mentioned, every single piece of equipment in this room probably has copper in it. Your phones have copper in it. Your cars have copper in it. So actually, for me, the underestimated demand driver is just everyday life. When you actually think about copper, it is everywhere. And so I think there are a lot of episodic attention is driven toward things like AI, EVs over the last few years, but we need to remember that it's literally in everything.
JJ?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. To put a finer point on kind of the AI piece, so that's absolutely right. It's the industrial use, it's the new energy technologies, it's the EV, it's all that. But I think the big question facing us is how much more copper is AI going to demand? And, the numbers are quite staggering when you look about it. This panel originally was supposed to talk about AI, so I actually did some digging around, but new AI data centers require 27 metric tons of copper per megawatt of installed capacity, according to Bloomberg. And then a single AI hyperscale center can require 45,000 metric tons per facility. So you're looking at, as those are building out across the country, across the world, the copper that's used for the cooling, for thermal management, for the grid, for all that, So the question is how much more? And I think people are just starting to scratch at that question, so.
Did you say 45,000 tons?
45,000 metric tons, yeah.
Yeah, so you need, a car weighs like 2 tons, right? So when you think about needing 22,500 tons of copper per car's worth of copper, that's a lot per facility. Dom.
Thanks, Graceland. Good morning, everybody. Fantastic to be here on a Monday. I agree with, obviously, Seth and JJ, and I think, obviously, from a perspective of AI and data centers, that's going to take a real path as we move forward. And obviously, JJ's put some statistics there in relation to the growing demand and the importance of copper as we move through this new technological age. But, to Seth's point, I think let's not forget that copper's still going to be required in everyday life. Urbanisation, electrification, industrialisation as it continues, as the world grows, and particularly developing countries continue to have higher standards of living, more housing comes on. As part more infrastructure is built. Take India, for example. If you look at electricity consumption in India today, it's about 1/7 of Japan, it's about 1/5 of China. And that's only going to continue to grow. And when you bring on housing, you bring on refrigeration, you bring on air conditioning, and as JJ said, copper is part of everyday life, and it's going to be needed more and more as we move forward. And yes, there's a major focus when it comes to copper on AI and data centers, and that's just natural because these are emerging trends. But ultimately today, if you look at that demand doubling by 2050 for copper, today 90% of that is still in traditional means in terms of demand for copper. Now, yes, there's going to be a substantial increase with AI and data centers, about 2% to 7%. But ultimately, as the world continues to develop, that's going to really continue to increase demand for copper. So it's incredibly important that governments around the world continue to do what they can to ensure that copper is extracted as quickly as possible, and our 3 companies are here to help with that.
Can I just add one more point? This AI revolution, as well as the EV battery race of the last few years, coupled with COVID and all the supply chain dynamics, really has put a spotlight on what has been the case forever. If we had this event 10 years ago, there'd be 6 people having Chick-fil-A in a back room. But now, because of everything happening after COVID, AI, et cetera, there's a spotlight on this dynamic. And so we just need to remember that no matter what happens with AI, copper is in everything. It's not an optional commodity.
So if the demand outlook is as good as it seems, right, for copper, and what are the commercial constraints to scaling up copper production?
Well, the obvious one, and we're probably all going to say it, is permitting reform, permitting issues, at least here in the US and probably some other key jurisdictions around the West. The oft-used statistic is 29 years to build a new mine. I'll speak for Glencore in terms of our own experience here. We have a very exciting project in the northeast of Minnesota called New Range Copper Nickel. It is a multi-generational opportunity in the Iron Range of Minnesota. It's a multi-metallic deposit. It's copper, nickel, PGMs, et cetera. We've been in the permitting process there for 15 years. Enormous amounts of money have been spent. We are dedicated to the project, as is our JV partner, Tech Resources. But why should that take so long to get through? when we all know that there is a demand issue here. We all know that we need more supply online. We all want more American supply of these materials. Yet the body politic has moved so incredibly slowly, just because of the broader dynamics we're all aware of in our politics, to get any sort of permitting reform through. So that's just the federal side of things. You layer on that the state dynamic, it gets quite complicated. So I think as a society, we need to really consider, do we actually want to build things, or do we want to admire the problem? And that's, I think, the key driver here.
And it was interesting because in our opening fireside today was Jared Agan from the White House, and he talked about how judicial reform and permitting reform are really key to advancing this agenda at this point, because without that, we're not going to get these projects off the ground. JJ, what's the most binding commercial constraint to getting what the copper?
Yeah, thinking about that, agree with Seth. I will add kind of the price of the commodity. It was Raheem from BMO earlier this morning talking about price matters for commodities. Same with copper. So you don't get a sustained high price of copper. It makes making additional investments difficult because, obviously things have to pencil. The long investment timeframes, the long lead times, you want to know that the price for that commodity, for copper in our case, you'll get the adequate return on investment. So at the end of the day, you need high prices to kind of sustain that investment.
Well, unfortunately, we're all saying the same thing. You wanted some diversity of views with diversity of companies. I'll add energy. I'll go back to permitting reform, but energy costs as well. I think that's a major issue facing companies around the world. When you've got these major operations, they require a lot of energy, and particularly in Western jurisdictions, you're seeing substantive increase in energy prices because there hasn't really been clarity around the policy settings, debates between net zero and traditional means of energy. And I think where the challenge lies there is because you've had these political debates on the left and the right in relation to it, it hasn't provided policy certainty to put energy prices down across the board. So when you're talking about these major investments that companies are making in relation to resource extraction, energy prices are a key part of that. So getting greater clarity in jurisdictions around the world when it comes to the policy settings will help, I think, bring down energy costs, and that will help drive capital investment across the board. I mean, obviously, I agree with both Seth and JJ in relation to permitting reform. Seth mentioned admiration of the problem. I think there's a lot of that going on, but that's better than not admiring the problem and just ignoring it. So that's a start, but there's a long way to go there. We've got a major copper project with our joint venture partner Rio Tinto in Arizona, a Resolution Copper that can provide up to 25% of US copper needs when it comes into operation. It's been stuck in the courts for a very, very long time. But it's not just that process, it's also the capital investment that goes into that, both between BHP and Rio Tinto in relation to that project. There's been about $2 billion of investment. Now, big companies like BHP, Rio, Glencore, Freeport, they can hold that. We've got the capacity to invest that capital. But if you're a smaller mining company, that makes it more difficult. And obviously you want big players in this area, but you also want smaller companies entering too. And it would be very, very difficult for a small mining company when you've got these long permitting times to be able to make those investments. When you've got lower cost of capital for bigger companies that have a very long-term horizon in relation to their investments, these smaller companies, I don't think, have that capacity. So that is a real problem for them. And also, I'd say for investors as well, in terms of if you're looking at where to invest capital globally, and you look at the mining sector, where you sit there and you look at all the regulation that's involved, the time that it takes, well, it becomes less attractive than investing in something like NVIDIA, right? So I think globally, this is a real challenge. And here in the US, I think it's a positive thing that there is admiration of the problem, but we've got to get to the next step, and that's doing something about it.
NVIDIA is a complicated place to put your money. So I want to ask you another question, Dom. I mean, Resolution Copper will be the highest ore grade copper project in the United States. It can meet 25% of our global demand, domestic demand here in the United States. Are you optimistic? I mean, this administration has really put its effort behind Resolution Copper.
Oh, I make the point. I think it's been incredibly refreshing dealing with this administration in respect of critical minerals. This project has been treated like a political football for a long time. It was, in terms of moving it forward, the Obama administration did that, and the Trump administration, the first Trump administration continued it. It was then put on hold by the Biden administration. Now it's put back on the agenda by the current administration. From my perspective, and someone who's been in politics before, in a different country in Australia, from the last 12 months working with this administration, it's been incredibly positive in terms of their engagement, their wanting to appreciate the challenges that are in front and how they can work with industry to overcome the needs. And from our perspective as working in global mining companies, we have a common pursuit, and that is to secure the critical minerals the United States needs, and they're aware of understanding the challenge and working with industry to get these projects moving as quickly as possible. And I think it's also pleasing to see that there, in many ways, is a bipartisan nature and support for getting critical minerals off the ground faster. There might be different motivations behind it, but ultimately I think everyone is singing off the same hymn book when it comes to wanting to get it done. It's just working towards solutions that will ultimately achieve it. I think the issue that Jared Agin raised this morning in respect of litigation is also, incredibly important. And obviously, the legal system plays an important role in making sure the right regulatory framework is abided by and supported. But when you end up in court for so long, it does make it incredibly challenging to get these projects off the ground. I mean, our Resolution Copper project ended up all the way up in the Supreme Court against the US government. It was then knocked out of the Supreme Court, and I thought the word Supreme Court, the trick would be in the name, and that was the Supreme Court of the land, and therefore that would be that. Not so the case. We're back at it again, and so it does make it incredibly challenging. But I think there are ways in which the US government, and I understand, there are lawmakers have bills before Congress at the moment in terms of judicial reform, as Jared has spoken about, and I think that's incredibly important. There are countries around the world that have courts set aside, particularly for mining projects or areas where the government at a certain point in time deems to be critical for their defence and national and energy security. And I think there are ways in which you can not skirt around the law and processes, but ultimately streamline and make more efficient the legal system here when dealing with these matters to get projects moving faster, because you just end up in appeal after appeal after appeal. And ultimately, I think change needs to be made in that space, as I said, not to get around the law, but to improve the efficiency in which these matters are dealt with.
And it's also interesting, as Raheem mentioned this, is that getting the courts right, getting the judicial reform right ends up becoming a de-risking tool, because you reduce the amount of time it takes before, we can't wait 30 years to get our money back.
Well, that's right.
Start making money.
And ultimately, you want these projects to occur. Let's take environmental regulation. There is a great advantage of having as many of these projects occurring in the United States, occurring in jurisdictions which have, low corruption risk, strong environmental protections, strong labour laws in place as well to increase people's standards of living. Right? These are the jurisdictions where you want to promote mining to occur, but ultimately you can't let perfection be the enemy of the good here. We've got to get the balance right. I think jurisdictions around the world are struggling with this, but ultimately working with industry, we can ensure that you have mining that's occurring in places with strong environmental practices. And I think particularly with leading global companies, that if you look at the last 50 years, you are really seeing higher environmental protections in place. We call closed mine sites legacy assets, right? But and one of the things that I've learned in this role is, and had the great opportunity to visit many sites that BHP operates, and they're fantastic examples of strong environmentalism. And I think, in many ways, people have a view of mining. I often say this is like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, underground tinkering away. Ultimately, technology has come a long way. Environmental practices have come a long way, and there's some very good stories out there in terms of rehabilitation that comes off the back of mining. We need to tell these stories more. As we've said already in this panel, copper is crucial. We need it in everyday life, and ultimately you've got mining standards that have increased drastically too. We just need to make sure that we get these processes through the courts as quickly as possible so we can get on with it.
Can I ask one question? I'll open it up to all three of you here, is how do we ensure, one of the reasons we play football with mining sector politically is because there's different weights placed on things like the environment and social ESG, environmental social governance. How do we ensure durabilities of projects where we can accelerate permitting, but without the trade-off of increasing the amount of negative externalities generated by these projects such that a political change could potentially disrupt a project? Because Seth, you've seen this happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, to Dom's point, I mean, some bipartisanship is going to be essential here. And some of that is incumbent on us as industry to do what we're doing now, which is the storytelling to help people understand why this is important. Because in many ways, this is turning into, it's almost like the patient capital story, right? So we're going to need society to really get on board with this being important, and that's why we have to drill down on why everything they uses copper, for instance, or anything else. In terms of the durability, yeah, I mean, it's tough, and I don't think anyone in this room or anywhere else has a solution to our politics necessarily, but the more we can keep talking to each other across the aisle, and we're starting to see green shoots there, I think we'll have some potential for durable legislation. I think the SPEED Act is a good start. And we saw some permitting reform get through in the last Congress as well. So I think we keep building on that. And then we also have to get the states on board. You have to engage the states. This is a multi-state thing as well. It's not just the federal story. So whether it's Arizona, whether it's Minnesota, other states as well, helping state governors and their teams understand the reality here, getting state legislators on board. A lot of people don't realize your state legislator, they might not be the most prominent person in politics, but in 10 years they could be a US senator. And so getting these ideas in the bloodstream of our politics are incredibly important.
I'll just add, I mean, Dom raised an important point. At the end of the day, the question is, do you want to build it here or not? And it's really not just about mines, right? It's about everything. People don't want the data centers now in their neighborhood because of, so where do you want it? Or renewable technologies, politically unpopular right now, but, we need more electricity. So at the end of the day, we all have to ask ourselves, if we want these things and we want to build them here, well, then we got to figure out ways to do it faster. And the SPEED Act is one way. There's other efforts on the Hill, looking at how they can, all sides can win, and it's politically agnostic for the future.
So I want to come to another topic. Let's shift direction a little bit. America has a lot of copper, but is the copper story of meeting future security a U.S. and allies partner, a U.S. or allies partner, or is it a U.S. only?
It's U.S. and partners.
Why? So
copper demand in the U.S. is about 1.6 million tons. We can, 1.2 million we can get. We have to import about 570-something thousand tons of that. I'll give you a very tangible example. We have the Horn smelter in northern Quebec province of Canada. It's one of 3 smelters in North America. You guys have one too, of course. We think that that's a really exciting ecosystem to preserve and maintain, because you can take and this ties into recycling, you can take your phones and tablets, e-scrap, e-waste, et cetera, that moves up to Canada. It could be sorted, turned into materials that then sent to our refinery, which we have. 99.99% pure copper comes back to the US. And the reason I give you all that detail is that's an established ecosystem within North America with an ally, with a treaty partner in Canada that's preserving US security of copper supply. There are going to be other opportunities as well. I know our companies are looking at Argentina, the DRC as well, where we are the largest Western operator, copper and cobalt. So I think we really need to consider our partners as part of the puzzle here.
Definitely agree with Seth, both. And that has to be true, because demand is much greater than what you can actually pull out of the ground in the US. Now, I think that gap that Seth spoke about can close, and if any country in the world is going to close that gap, it's the United States with technology advancements, opportunities of now looking at different things like recycling. So I think that gap can certainly close over time, but ultimately that gap is too high. And in any event, so that gap's too high to fill the void. You want to continue to drive domestic supply, and I think we've seen during the pandemic and in other situations in the past that whether it's resources or other areas which impacts your energy, defence, security, you want to make sure you've got a very, very strong domestic supply of those things that are crucial to the security of a country without having to rely on partners. Now, that will never be perfect, but I think you certainly want to be doing that in case future challenges come the way of the world, come the way of the US, that you need to have a very, very strong domestic supply in a whole range of things. So in terms of partners, I think there's a real opportunity to continue to focus on that, where you can look at allied countries, and particularly those that are very close jurisdictionally. Seth raised Argentina, we're investing, but I look at Chile, for example, where we've got the biggest copper operation in the world, Escondida there. I mean, Chile is a jurisdiction which provides a significant amount of copper cathodes into the United States and is obviously jurisdictionally close, but also from an allied perspective is there as well. So I think there's a real opportunity as well where countries can work together. The US can work with other jurisdictions in relation to global standards, where you can actually get, I think, alignments and synergies in relation to what we expect when it comes to that previous topic we spoke about in terms of labour laws, environmental protections, corruption risks and things like that, where countries can work together to help each other when it comes to energy security in the critical mineral space and particularly copper. But I don't think any jurisdiction can do it alone. The US is no different to that. And so my 2 points here would be, you've got to drive domestic supply for your own energy and defence security, number one. And number two, work with those countries to help you do it. So you've got that security moving forward to fill that gap that will be very difficult to kind of close.
JJ.
Yeah, no surprise the multinationals, think it's U.S. and international, right? But the only point I'll add, look, the deposits, the rocks are where the rocks are, okay? And if we need the copper or whatever mineral, we're got to go and get it wherever it is. So, companies like ours, that's our task for, to make profits, for enhanced shareholder value, the geopolitics, security, all those things, right? So, and I think, listen to Jared this morning, he definitely recognized that, right? America first, yes. Agree, but also looking at kind of ways to partnering with, international countries. And you see that reflected in how the U.S. government is approaching foreign governments right now, talking about critical minerals, copper included. So,
Minerals diplomacy has really become synonymous with U.S. foreign policy this year in a way that I personally never expected. What tools can we use to advance our mineral security interests, particularly in this hemisphere, but also places like the DRC? What tools does the U.S. government have to support industry in these jurisdictions? Some of these are relatively new jurisdictions, like Argentina. Argentina is not a major copper exporter. Some of these are high-risk jurisdictions, see no further than the DRC. How should we be thinking about what tools we can use to make these efforts easier for companies that want to go there?
I'll take a stab at it. So, I've thought about this in kind of, the hardware and the software of kind of mining, right? The hardware, the infrastructure, the roads, the electricity, the water, the transportation needs to get at a deposit or extract it to market, right? So, most mining companies don't want to build extra infrastructure that's not needed for the project. So if the U.S. government has a role to build some of that infrastructure that can enable us to go in and to then and make that additional investment for the mine, even better. On the software side, it's things like, in having kind of the right kind of investment conditions that will favor that can then look favorably on that jurisdiction. So whether it's ISDS, and we know there's certain companies that kind of need that assurance to make those multi-decade investments, or it's the right fiscal regimes that countries are kind of weighing with mining taxes and other things. So it's, if the U.S. government has a role to kind of, incentivize those countries to kind of, get those things right, or to show them best practices, that's kind of, the best I think the U.S. government can do. And then let us do the kind of the commercial aspects.
Seth?
Yeah, I agree with everything JJ just said. I think you're seeing some interesting tools come out, critical minerals agreements. You're seeing the DFC and the XM Bank get more involved. I think those are all very positive things. The more sophisticated we can build our U.S. apparatus for getting involved in these things, the better. I think your term of minerals diplomacy is exactly the right one, because we do need an entire work stream for this coming from the U.S. government. I also think doubling down on the last discussion about partnership, helping our international partners understand that this is a give and take, and this is a real partnership between the United States and X country. And so I think Argentina is going to be a very interesting example of that in the years ahead.
Can I ask you one question? With the DRC, I mean, you guys are basically one of the last Western companies in the DRC. What does success look like at this moment in time?
Well, I think we saw a great first step toward that with the peace deal. And I think the next step is going to be seeing increased U.S. engagement in the region. If you look, my understanding was that in the 70s, we had dozens of economic officers on the ground through the State Department and others around Congo. And we got to a point where the nadir was maybe a few. And so you didn't really have any U.S. officials, any U.S. interests there on the ground, barely any Western interests, if you will. I think hopefully we'll see an uptick in the presence of the U.S. government there. We welcome U.S. companies coming in with us into the Congo and other partners. We look forward to more partnerships there. We're extremely proud of our business in the Congo. We employ 18,000 people there, hundreds of thousands of tons of copper and cobalt is, the DRC is key for cobalt, 70%, as you know, of supply. So I think the more U.S. interest we see, and it's not just around mining, it's also U.S. business showing an interest in the country. And it's the same thing you're going to see in Argentina and Chile, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we can see more U.S. businesses from other sectors there as well, which hopefully we'll start to see post-peace deal, it's going to get very interesting.
And you've seen a strong interest from the DRC in wanting to work with partners that are not just China as a diversification narrative in and of themselves. Dominic, I want to come to you. What are the jurisdictions that you're most excited about looking ahead?
Well, I'm here in the US, so the US. No, I'll make the point about the US because there's obviously the challenges around permitting reform and that you speak of. But one of the obviously the most attractive aspects of the United States is that once you get through all of that, I mean there's a stat that's always thrown around. From identification to extraction of a resource, the US is the second slowest in the world at 29 years, just behind Zambia. But once you're there, you've got a great environment to operate. You've got strong certainty. Whereas if you look at other jurisdictions, you might get there faster, but then you don't have that certainty, and there's obviously greater risk once you're in an operation situation. I'd say Argentina. We've made a significant investment recently in Vicuna, a site called Vicuna, which is arguably probably the biggest copper discovery in the last 30 years. And for a company like BHP, what makes Argentina, I think, attractive is that not only is it from to JJ's point, where the rocks are, right? They've got they're endowed very well with copper in a very similar way to Chile, but you've got a government at the moment with Malay who is very much focused on reducing regulation, on providing investment certainty for companies in relation to particularly critical minerals and resources. If you look at Western jurisdictions over the last 20 or 30 years, you're seeing kind of situation where you're regulating yourself into very challenging areas. We spoke about energy prices. You've got high energy prices. You've seen a substantial increase in regulation, which is increasing the cost of capital in these jurisdictions. And it's quite refreshing to look at a jurisdiction like Argentina that is wanting to work very closely with companies to invest in the country, to lower the regulatory burden, and to provide that investment certainty over the long term. Part of they've got a 30-year focus in relation to providing certainty in respect of royalties and taxation. Seth spoke about certainty. Certainty is crucial, particularly in circumstances where you're not making a short-term investment. Companies are making investments that are decades long, and to know that what the conditions are going to be for the long term is incredibly important. And I think when you look at a country like Argentina right now, and they received a lot of criticism politically a couple of years ago, I can certainly say from a BHP perspective that the approach they have to doing business in Argentina is refreshing compared to other jurisdictions globally, and it's all about lowering regulation, providing certainty. And I think they're seeing that the fruits of the rewards coming through in respect of capital investment being driven into the country.
And so I want to come back home. So this year was a big year for copper. It joined the critical minerals list, which was a really big step. And it was a really big step because it's a very powerful market signal about what the US government is prioritizing. And I'd like to open this question to all three of you as we start to close up, is what concrete next steps should the US take to accelerate domestic mining and refining of copper now that we're critical?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So the USGS, getting copper and critical minerals list, fantastic first step. We need more. If you've talked to me, in the past few months, we're very focused on what are the things that will incentivize companies like Freeport, like us here, to kind of make that additional investment. And there's one specific tax credit that we're just so kind of focused on right now. There was. The IRA, for all its, political baggage, there was some good things in there for critical minerals. One of them was is the 45X tax credit, advanced manufacturing and production tax credit. It has some very specific minerals that are eligible for that tax credit. Copper is not one of them. It should be. We could talk to me afterwards of why it should be and what Congress can do to kind of make it that way. But certainly that's one very specific kind of, tax credit that will then, allow companies like Freeport and others to kind of pull forward those investment decisions that might be kind of, waiting for a sustained high enough copper price, but to know that if there's kind of a tax credit that could benefit, you can pull those projects forward. So that's definitely one thing I would highlight.
Just very briefly, I can't underscore enough the importance of getting the permitting story right so that we can get New Range built, so Resolution and other projects can get through. Because once these projects are up and running, I think you'll see a whole paradigm shift. And the thing is, if we get through our permitting story and our process, and we're not alone in this, any project will be the same thing, and there is a whiplash back and forth, we're going to be having the same conversation in 10 years, except for we're going to be either further in the hole. So if we can just get that permitting thing right, we're good to go.
I think just reiterate the points that have been made on the panel so far. Permitting reform, litigation reform. I agree with JJ in relation to 45X. I think those are the kind of things when you were looking at critical minerals to bring copper into that and obviously copper's been put as a critical mineral, but make sure the same kind of incentives were there for other minerals are obviously included for copper. Couple of things. I'd say continuing to work with industry to raise the awareness with the public about the importance of critical minerals, and I think that has come a long, long way. Having discussions like this brings the public on side. Reform is hard in politics, bringing the public, and it's really important to bring the public with you, and I think there's been a much greater understanding of the importance of critical minerals and the role they play in everyday life has really picked up. I mean, over the last few years, I think if you went back, do some polling on this, that most people wouldn't appreciate how their iPhones work or what resources are required to achieve that. Everyone's using AI on their phone, but how is it going to occur? How is it going to occur in the future? Driving around with EVs. It's important that the resource industry continues to be able to do its job to enable everyday life and standards of living, both here in the United States and around the world, to continue to grow. We want, as a civilization, to continue to progress. That's what's happened throughout history, and people have always been doomsayers at various points in time in history that things will slow down, but the human race have always found ways in which to constantly increase the standards of living across the board, and resources and mining plays a fundamental role in doing that. And I think for policymakers, having the public aware of that and the importance of our industry, I think will continue to be fundamental to success. We can say we want this change or we want streamlining of processes, but not as an end to itself. Yes, there's money to be made for companies, but there's great benefits to people across the world. And so, I think the three of us and our companies, and we have a duty as well to be on panels like this, to be out telling the story, but ultimately to continue to work with governments to raise the profile and the importance of the industry, so that policymakers can do their job in bringing the public with them on the journey.
My final question to you all is looking ahead to 2026. 2025 has been a year of great progress, but there have also been challenges. The sunset out of 45X over time is one of the challenges that we contend with, given the long-term nature of project development. But looking ahead to 2026, what is one intervention that would support the copper industry further? Are we missing anything in terms particularly around making it a more economic, but also thinking about longevity and durability? How do we ensure that the momentum from this year continues on?
Well, I'll start. I think one of the things that we need to focus on is that all these resources are different. And they need a different policy lens for each of them. And there's obviously a major focus on rare earths. But if you look at the market for that, it's about 10 billion. Copper is over 200 billion. Oil and gas is over $1 trillion. And so not every resource should be treated the same. And I think from a policymaker's perspective, there needs to be the critical thinking in relation to what is needed to get each of these different resources extracted faster. And whether that's from extraction to refinery, it's not a one-size-fits-all policy approach. And that's difficult because in a perfect world it would be, and it'd be easy for policymakers to set a regulation that improves all of these things, but it's just not the case. And so I think it's, I think we've come, as you say, this year I think has been a very strong year for critical minerals in terms of raising the awareness. For example, I came to the US 15 months ago. Just in that 15 or 16 months, I've seen a significant increase in the understanding and awareness amongst policymakers in relation to critical minerals. Substantial. And that we just need that momentum to continue, whether that's copper, iron, or a whole range of rare earths that policymakers are dealing with those challenges. It's not an easy area of policy. It is complex. But I think making sure that focus and determination is there and an understanding and a deeper appreciation that the challenges with each resource is different, and looking at the policy settings for those for individually. If that work is done, I think 2026 will even be better than 2025.
Thanks, JJ.
Can I say 45X again?
you can hit home an important point.
I know, no. All kidding aside, no. In addition, going back to where we started, right, where we talked about copper's use in all facets of kind of technology, industrial use, coming AI, electricity, all those things. Fundamentally, if there's economic growth here in the U.S. and in the world, then that's good for copper, right? Remember, copper is Dr. Copper. It's a good kind of corollary to economic growth. So if you have those things, firing on all cylinders here in the U.S. and around the world, then, it's going to be good for copper price. So at the end of the day, whether it's getting the AI policy right, electricity generation, just whatever economic growth, make sure you're doing those things correctly so that, all rising tide lifts all boats for us, right? So.
Let's close this out.
Yeah, I don't know how many people in the room have watched Gilded Age on HBO. It's a great show. There is a call out for copper in a couple episodes. And that just shows you that this story goes way back. And if you look at even the founding of the United States and what led to the Revolutionary War, these were resource questions in many ways. So some things don't change. What we also need to make sure doesn't change is the momentum that we've been building over the last few years and that JJ and Dom have just alluded to in terms of policy shifts and really public recognition of the importance of this stuff. So next year we're going into midterm elections. It's going to be a politically chaotic year. I think everybody just needs to remember that this stuff does not have a party label. I think we need to understand that we need copper for literally everything that we're going to do to be successful as a nation. And again, it's whether it's AI, whether it's your phone, whether it's a car, everything else, the buildings, these cameras here, the more we can keep hammering home to people that copper is in literally everything that they touch almost. If it's not grown or mined, it's mined. I think the better off we'll be, and we'll be able to preserve the wins that we're going to get over the next couple of years.
Thanks so much. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. This way. Be a really great discussion. I'm really excited about it.
Absolutely. I'll try to fill in for Young.
You're going to do great. Congressman Barra has served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2013, representing California's 6th District. Representative Barra currently serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on East Asia and Pacific and on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Thanks so much. You've been thinking a lot more about critical minerals. Can you tell me how you've seen critical minerals and minerals diplomacy in particular elevated as a policy issue within House Foreign Affairs Committee over the last year?
Absolutely. In recent months, we've seen, because of the escalating trade rhetoric between the United States and China, some critical choke points. So if we didn't understand the importance of having redundant supply chains, having access to multiple sources, that really exposed it. We can go back to the pandemic, and obviously that also exposed an over-reliance on a single source. So it's been a nonpartisan topic. Democrats and Republicans have been talking about this. It's a topic that comes up in conversation with our allies. Part of the reason why we introduced the Mineral Security Partnership Act is that's a pretty elegant piece of legislation that came out of the Biden administration. But we should be working with our friends and allies to create these redundant supply chains.
And what do better partnerships with our allies look like at a time when minerals are redefining a lot of our relationships?
It means, leveraging, I'm glad we reauthorized the DFC and gave DFC a little bit more flexibility, but it means using those tools with the financing tools that Japan might have, or Korea, or others. It means going into Mongolia with the Koreans and creating new industries and so forth. It means going into Africa with our allies, perhaps working with Australia and others to build these redundant supply chains. So again, we're not just reliant on a single source. In this case, China very strategically over decades has built out their market and capacity in the critical mineral space, their refining capacity, et cetera. And then we also notice some of the market manipulation that makes it very difficult for others to break into these industries to create these mines and so forth. So it's not that the rare earths and these critical minerals are not readily available. It's just very difficult to build this market out because China does have a dominant position.
And global diversification takes a lot of effort. When you think that China actually leveraged its foreign policy to get minerals from around the world for the better part of 30 or 40 years. 2025 was a big year for some minerals legislation. Can you tell us about some of these legislative efforts?
Certainly we're excited about the Mineral Security Partnership, but you also see other pieces of legislation, trying to align trade promotion with, critical minerals. You see, as Chairman Mass has gone through a State Department reauthorization, we've looked at the E-Bureau and what does that look like and how does that also align with our strategic values here. So, as a preview, I think some of this is all going to come together. We're talking across committees of jurisdiction to try to put together a big package that would put us in a much better position.
What does a strengthened mineral security partnership look like?
Strengthening Mineral Security Partnership is aligning various entities. So it's aligning our trade agenda. It's aligning our diplomatic agenda. It's aligning, as I said before, our financing tools. Because again, it may not be that we're doing refining in the United States per se, but it may mean that we build markets in Malaysia or Vietnam or other places that we strategically go into Africa, where you see some of these supplies, working with our partners to build out these mines, because we may not be able to do it by ourselves, but if we work again with, through, our allies and friends, we can hopefully build some redundancy.
Beyond financing, what are the other touch points of what better collaboration look like? Because we sometimes limit it to money, but it's more than that.
Yeah, it's more than money. It is, again, strategically building out refining capacity, strategically looking at what countries we may want to go in and build a closer relationship. But then, even closer to home, in Southern California by the Salton Sea, you have huge lithium deposits. That's a conversation that's come up multiple times, where could you build out in a very environmentally friendly, closed way, take advantage of some of our own critical minerals here.
So when we look ahead to 2026, how do we build on the efforts of 2025 from a legislative perspective?
I think you take various pieces of legislation across different jurisdictions, Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, and can you put those together in a single package? Again, a small preview, I think we're getting pretty close to pulling a bunch of things together into a larger package, working in collaboration with the administration and so forth, because again, we recognize this is an important area. Another interesting area that we've been thinking about, and it came up last week because the cobalt folks were in our office, and they said something really interesting, that 18% of the cobalt that we need is sitting in our desk drawers, right? In our devices that are just sitting there. I'd love to be able to get rid of my old iPads and iPhones and all of that. So recycling is another component of this, and how do we think about that? How do we invest in that so those devices are put to use?
And what does, we're all kind of sitting now with the same objective on the horizon. We want more resilient supply chains that can't be weaponized to ensure that our manufacturing industry stay intact, to make sure that we can protect ourselves. The legislative agrees on that. The executive branch agrees on that. But what does better coordination look like between the legislative and executive branches of government look like on this topic?
It means we should be talking to one another. And that doesn't always happen in this administration at this moment in time. I think this is an area where you do see strategic alignment, Democrats, Republicans. Chairwoman Kim and I are, either one of us could be sitting here, we'd be saying the same thing. You saw that in the hearing that we had earlier this year as well, that, again, it's a very nonpartisan issue. Industry also aligns with us because they recognize the critical value. And then, if you look at the DoD and the importance of having these supplies, they're critical to our national security.
One of the lines from one of the previous panels was that mining sometimes gets caught up in political football, right? We start, we stop, we prioritize, and we deprioritize. How do we ensure that the solutions that you're developing now have longevity and durability at a time when things do feel like a game of football?
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, again, I think pre-pandemic, folks got relatively lax in terms of thinking these supplies would be there forever. Obviously, the pandemic disrupted that. We've seen some of the potential coercive nature that supplies could be used against us if there is a conflict with the PRC. So I think there is a real recognition for national security economic perspective. We are going to have to build redundant supply chains. I mean, there are also conversations about what do stockpiles look like? Do you create those stockpiles? How do you replenish those stockpiles? How do you move things through if there's degradation over time of these critical minerals? So again, those are conversations that are taking place.
One of the things I always think is that the U.S. has and our allies have an advantage when we go to some of the global South countries that you mentioned. We often bring a better way of doing business. How do we ensure that we are not creating a trade-off between speed and doing things right?
Yeah, so if you look at the, I think President Trump would take it as a compliment that he's been massively disruptive in terms of how we do aid, development, investment. If we look at the African continent, I do think the Trump administration is going to take a much more transactional approach. So, instead of just direct aid and development, they may say, how do we invest here? Okay, we need these critical minerals. DRC, you've got cobalt. We'll come in, we'll invest. What's that return on investment? It's a different way of doing business, but I do think you'll see more of that transactional approach. And again, maybe that will be done in partnership with our allies.
So it sounds like commercial diplomacy has kind of replaced a traditional aid mentality.
I think that's where the Trump administration has gone. Will the pendulum swing back somewhere in the middle? I don't think it'll swing all the way back. And again, just because of Beijing's ability to undercut price, to undercut, make it very difficult for mines to be competitive. I think that is where we have to leverage our financing tools, work together with our allies and others.
So how do we better use the tools in our toolkit? The U.S. government has a lot of tools. You mentioned DFC, we have EXIM, we have U.S. Trade and Development Agency. How do we better, none of these institutions are really designed for minerals at the outset.
No, so again, how do we bring them all together? How do we create, for lack of a better, an individual that's working across the various agencies and across departments looking at this? Again, we recognize this is critical to our national security, critical to our economic security. So instead of it being siloed in one agency or another agency, maybe we do need that, for lack of a better way of describing it, a critical mineral czar that can kind of look across the entire spectrum of the U.S. government.
Should that be a person? Should that be an institution? What does better coordination look like? Because I think you're right. I think here at CSIS we counted, and there are about 15 agencies that are somehow working on minerals right now.
I mean, it's probably that it probably is an individual that has responsibility with a team of individuals that can look across the U.S. government as a whole. It probably, and then you have someone who can coordinate with Congress as well.
Are there any other legislative mechanisms we can use to advance this agenda?
So I think there is, and what you talked about earlier is we've got to take a long view here, right? Because to build out that redundancy, to build out these mines, we can't stop and start. We've got to invest and take that longer view. So I do think that's where Congress has to be invested. Again, I think we've got all the tools. Can we bring the tools together in a much more coordinated way? And if there are places where, again, I do think we did a smart thing by, in the reauthorization of the DFC, giving it a little bit more flexibility, giving it the ability to work in countries that previously it probably wouldn't have been able to work in. So again, looking for those areas. But I think that's where, if we do it legislatively, then it's not going to shift from one administration to the next. It'll be a much more long-term investment.
What are the key DFC changes that you think would make it better fit for minerals?
I mean, giving it flexibility to work in different countries, giving it flexibility to work in slightly wealthier countries than it currently has, giving it additional financing tools and additional resources. I think we also have to be flexible because we may have to work in some countries that aren't necessarily the best actors, but that's where these resources are. So what does that look like? I think we'll also have to, again, China is able to undercut the price point, but if we want to build out, let's say Australia is very interested in building out these industries, it may come at a slight economic upcharge to industry and so forth. But again, if we don't want to be vulnerable to coercion, industry may have to do some of that as well.
Do you think it's industry and government that might have to be step in on that?
I mean, I think we'll have to do this together. And again, I'll come back to recycling. I think that really is a component here as well. What does that look like, and how do we make that economically viable and build out that industry?
So, final question. Looking ahead to 2026, if you had to prioritize two things that whole of government, legislative, executive, could work together most meaningfully to advance our goals of creating more resilient supply chains, what would they be?
I mean, I would hope on the congressional side that we look across the various committees of jurisdiction, look at the various pieces of legislation and bring them together in a single package. In addition, as we're looking at the E-Bureau and what tools they need, that's from the foreign affairs side of things. How do we modernize that with the focus here? So that would be one thing that I would do. I would hope we're doing that with the administration, with the Senate. So again, you'll have a piece of legislation that can move fairly quickly. And again, I think that is going to happen.
Sounds like it might be imminent.
Maybe, could be.
That'd be very exciting. I mean, it is
More to
really
come.
it is really exciting to see minerals not only be bipartisan, but also one of the areas where we're able to mobilize multilateral cooperation.
Yeah, again, I think this is an area where mineral diplomacy could work. It's in our conversation with our friends and allies, everyone recognizes the vulnerability here. Everyone recognizes it's not in anyone's interest to just have a single source supply chain, that we will have to work together to create these markets, to create the competition and create redundant supply chains. So again, for a lot of the advanced nations, I think everyone in a very intentional way is, moving in this direction.
And global South countries realize how important it is as well. I mean, they're very much racing to be part of this discussion.
Absolutely. So I think if we're smart about it, it certainly helps build out industry in the global South. That helps address some needs, and hopefully, we don't just, we do it in a way that's economically beneficial to some of these countries.
Well, thank you so much for joining
Great,
us.
thank you.
I'm excited to see how these legislative efforts continue to strengthen our mission clarity and execution.
More to come.
Stay tuned, guys. Thank you.